If your goal is to be better at life, your first assumption is going to be to pursue happiness, but that is a mistake. Happiness is a result that cannot be directly pursued. It can only be born of a set of behaviors, becoming anti-fragile and pursuing truth and authenticity. Here is controversial YouTuber, author, and award-winning professor Gad Saad with the surprising path to happiness. So as you think about the way to orchestrate happiness, one, I think it's important to define happiness. If it isn't the sort of passing, momentary happiness of eating a bowl of ice cream or having good sex, but those are actually both parts of this thing. What is that cocktail of truth and freedom? Is that the only parts of the cocktail?
Right. So the watching the porn, having the good sex, eating the ice cream, and the juicy burger, those are the dopamine hits, right? They're tickling my pleasure center. So they're ephemeral, they're passing. Happiness, in the way that I'm using the term, in the way that most philosophers who've written about the topic would use the term, is through the serotonin system, right? I mean, I'm sitting on the proverbial porch when I'm 85. I'm looking back at my life and I'm saying, you know what? I've lived a good life. I've built a great marriage. I have great kids. I've had a job that has given me infinite purpose and meaning. I've got an incredible group of friends that I trust. So it is in that enduring sense, existential sense, that I'm feeling content in myself. So eating the ice cream is great. It can give me a momentary hit of dopamine rush, but it isn't what I mean by happiness. Um, you want to talk a bit more about the know thyself, the authenticity part?
Yeah, if that's a key part of this. Before we do that, though, I want to. So when I talk to people about happiness, which is always how people package the question, what I'm very careful to migrate them to is, don't worry about happiness. Happiness to me is the transient thing. What you're talking about in the serotonin system, I would call fulfillment.
Right.
Now, I think fulfillment has a very knowable recipe, and I want to see if we agree on that or if we have a convergence at the definition level, in which case I'll want to get your specific definition. So my recipe for fulfillment, which is, I think, the neurochemical state that people long for, not just when they're 85 on the porch, but from moment to moment. Because fulfillment to me is the thing that can survive grief. You can be fulfilled and grieving at the same time. You can't be happy and grieving at the same time.
Right.
So for me, it's based on evolution. So I know a secret about your future that I won't rat you out here.
Right.
But you and I share an obsession.
Can I just say what the context
Please.
is? You had asked what is my next book possibly about, and I shared it with you, which we won't discuss.
Yes.
But yeah, that's what it is.
So super intrigued. I want people to understand that evolution has planted these, what I'll call biological algorithms in your brain. So there are things compelling you to act a certain way, feel a certain way all the time. And so working hard is one of those. You can understand from an evolutionary perspective why you would need to work hard. So you need to work hard, whatever you're doing. You're going to work hard to gain a set of skills that allow you to serve not only yourself, but other people.
Sure.
And as long as it's a set of skills that you find intrinsically interesting, so that your goal is exciting to you, that to me is the shortest recipe I can think of for what actually leads to the quote unquote good life.
Right.
Does that feel accurate?
That it is accurate. I would cover the other end of the evolutionary story. I have a section in the book on the mismatch hypothesis, which is an evolutionary principle that explains why, in some cases, we stray away from happiness or mental health or physical health, because it's also relevant to our existential happiness. So the mismatch hypothesis, Tom, is the idea that a behavior or a preference that might have been adaptive in our evolutionary past becomes maladaptive in the contemporary environment. So the classic example of that phenomenon would be our gustatory preferences. So we've evolved the preference for fatty foods. Now, you and I might have different preferences. I might like juicy steak. You might like chocolate mousse. But we probably both prefer those two foods or sources than, say, raw broccoli or tofu.
This is correct.
Right? And the reason for that is very simple, because your ancestors and mine evolved in an environment of caloric scarcity and caloric uncertainty. Therefore, it would have made sense for them to have evolved those preferences, which are then passed down. In today's environment, where there isn't caloric uncertainty or caloric scarcity, then we get some of the biggest killers: colon cancer and heart disease and high blood pressure and diabetes. Many of these are preventable based on the types of foods that we eat. So that's an example of the mismatch hypothesis in evolutionary medicine. But let's apply it, say, to how we live our lives in terms of social relationships. We've evolved, as you probably heard, the Dunbar number is something that the evolutionary anthropologist Robin Dunbar talked about, that roughly we've evolved with around 150 people around us in our evolutionary past. But then we have very tight relationships with these concentric groups of these 150 people. Social relationships are the most important thing to our happiness. As a matter of fact, I'll come back to Dunbar's number in a second. I quote in the book the main finding from 80 plus years of research at Harvard, longitudinally tracking people. The number one factor that describes how well you will feel later in life is the quality of your social relationships, even more so than your cholesterol levels. So don't worry about taking a statin to lower your LDL scores. Make sure that you have 2, 3, 4 friends that you really trust and love, and you can engage in reciprocal rituals with, right? And so Dunbar's number expects us to have these tight bonds. Now, I could live in New York surrounded by 8 million people, and yet I feel unbelievably alone because I'm not instantiating any of those tight reciprocal bonds. So I am with 8 million people, and yet I'm incredibly lonely. And so one of the ways by which we can apply evolutionary principles to happiness is seeing some of these mismatches and how we can resolve that mismatch so that we can be happier.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so we know that we can become misaligned, but we also know that there are these programs running in our mind. One of them, so if we're going to use that shared definition, a big part of this is you have to know what's exciting to you. So we come back to know thyself. So how do you come to know yourself, and how do you deal with things like where your need, because you and I are very different. I am very much a pleaser. I'm not disagreeable at all. I would score very low on disagreeability. So how do you deal with when you have a thing to be authentic to yourself? You have to constantly face that. One, how do you come to recognize that? And how do you recognize the difference between a thing that you should embrace about yourself and something you should try to change about yourself?
Those are big questions. So let me give you an example of this kind of know thyself. Perfectionism, something that I regrettably suffer from. So in one of the chapters of the book, I talk about everything in moderation. So the sweet spot, which Aristotle had spoken about more than 2,000 years ago when he argued that, for example, a soldier who is too cowardly is not good. A soldier who's too reckless in his courage is not good. The best soldier is the one who is somewhere in the middle. And so what I argue in that chapter is everything in life amounts to finding the sweet spot in that domain. There is no law of nature that is more ubiquitous than the inverted U. Too little is not good, too much is not good. The right point is somewhere in the middle. So perfectionism, for example, if you're not in the least bit perfectionist, then let's say you're an author, then your work will suffer because you don't have any attention to details, right? You'll be sloppy. Your references will be poorly cited, right? If you are on the other end of the curve where I lie, which is when you receive the galley proofs of your book, instead of rejoicing that you're in the final step, you go into a complete full-blown panic attack because this is the last time that I will have a chance to pick up a typo or a comma that's out of place. I end up spending an inordinate amount of time rereading the book to catch that typo. Well, it would have made a lot more sense pragmatically to recognize that it's okay if there's a typo, and I could have spent those 2 weeks doing something a lot more productive that gives me a lot more bang for my buck. Well, but I have to have the humility and the introspection to be able to say, I suffer from perfectionism. What can I do to change it? So the old cliche is, the first step is to recognize that you have a problem, and you can only do that if you're truly humble within yourself. Same thing when I lost a lot of weight. I could have jumped on the Lizzo bandwagon and said, you are healthy at any size. Or I could have listened to my physician and to myself and to the mirror that said to me, you need to lose weight. People don't live to be 100 if they are 50, 60, 70 pounds overweight. So it takes honesty, it takes introspection, it takes authenticity, it takes humility. Put it all together. Hopefully you make the necessary changes.
It's interesting. So one thing I think a lot about is what I call frame of reference.
Right.
So Frame of reference, the easiest way for me to explain it is the distorted lens through which you view the world. There is no such thing as seeing objective reality. I think that we live in a simulation in a metaphorical sense, but it borders on literal because your brain is encased in total darkness. Light never reaches your eyes. Colors don't exist objectively. They exist only in the simulation where you're taking photons of a certain wavelength and you, for whatever evolutionary reason, our eyes have chosen to interpret that as certain colors. But they don't really exist. And so once that reality sinks in for people and you realize everything, your every intake, the way that you frame the world, see it, all of it, it is your brain's trying to deal with the overwhelming amount of complexity. And so it simplifies it into a useful fashion, but it is by nature a distortion. And so once you realize, okay, everything that my brain is doing is a distorted version of what's really there, and it's being distorted by my beliefs and my values. And my beliefs are actually a choice that hopefully are grounded in reality, but not always.
Right.
And once you realize, oh, okay, I can begin to shape my frame of reference. Now, not unhinge it from reality because you want to be as predictively accurate as possible, but you're going to build that frame of reference. And when you take over that process, you realize I get to choose the things that I care about. I get to choose the things that I believe about myself. And then that is going to play out in whether or not something is fulfilling or it makes you happy. Because if it's in alignment with your values, so I'll go back to you prize authenticity in a way that I'm sure a lot of people don't, because someone may equally prize getting along.
Yes.
Like it's better to get along and to be a bit more of a chameleon and be able to justify that. So how do you help people navigate that? Like, are there ways?
I struggle with this. Sorry to
No,
interrupt
please,
you.
by all means.
I struggle with this when I go after someone on social media. By the way, when I say go after, I don't go after them personally. I go after a position that they've taken.
Sure.
I don't wish ill on anyone, and sometimes it seems as though I'm being personal, but I really am. I don't try to frivolously insult. But if you say something insane, and I think that this is really dangerously wrong, then I will weigh in. Well, I've known some people that I've hesitated to go after because I had multiple codes of conduct that were pulling me in opposing directions. So to your point about how do you navigate this? So on the one hand, there's a code of conduct of, you always defend the truth no matter what. It's a deontological statement. They are absolute truths, absolute principles that are inviolable, that should never be violated, okay? So that's comparing deontological versus consequentialist. Consequentialist would be, it's okay to lie if I'm sparing your feelings. Deontological would be, it's never okay to lie. For most things, we are always operating in consequentialist world. It makes sense. But for certain things, freedom of speech, presumption of innocence, journalistic integrity, those should be deontological principles. And so I've struggled at times where someone that I know personally, and therefore there's a different code of conduct. I've had dinner with you. I've been to your home. And therefore the Middle Eastern honor and shame culture kicks in, that I don't want to embarrass you publicly. Now I'm struggling. Do I go after this person? They are a friend, but they're saying some real bullshit. And so usually what happens is I will bite my tongue until the authenticity deontological thing supersedes the being nice to someone that I know. So it's a struggle we all have, but at least the fact that I am introspecting about what to do is the right approach, right? That means I'm struggling with a real conundrum. And so if you don't have the capacity, so take, for example, a narcissist, a truly malignant narcissist, they can't do the calculus that I just engaged in, right? So a narcissist will say, I never make mistakes. I don't need to ever apologize. I've had narcissists in my nuclear family. Well, it's very difficult to have a healthy relationship if you proclaim as a universal statement, I never make mistakes. I never need to apologize. We all make mistakes. I apologize to my dog if she greets me at the door and I don't give her the proper attention because I'm caught up in my thoughts. I'll go back and say, I'm sorry, right? I'm humble enough to apologize to my dog. So there is no magic recipe other than having the humility and introspective capability to navigate through these conundrums.
Okay, so as we try to navigate those, you're breaking things into the two camps, the sort of never do's and the conditionally do's. How does one do that well? So let's take truth and freedom, which are, I think, two very important things, because I have a North Star of human flourishing. And so everything that I do, I'm trying to aim it towards what improves human flourishing for the largest number of people, what decreases human suffering. But most people don't have a North Star. They've never thought about it.
Right.
So do you have like a set of principles that you've knowingly walked through that people will need to walk through in order to be happy? Like, do you have things that you're like, these are the things that are inviolable?
As relating to the deontological versus
that everybody. So if you think about this, your book feels like an instruction manual.
Right.
So if I think about your book as an instruction manual, and I think about, okay, you have to be the architect of your happiness, and you have to do the work, then I want to get really specific about what that work is. So first, to me, is what's your North Star?
Right.
And then it's, okay, what are the things that if you don't do, you will inevitably violate that North Star? So I'll give one, which the thing I find myself thinking about more and more is right now, freedom of speech is coming under attack. And when I think about my North Star is human flourishing, I don't think you can get there without freedom of speech.
I couldn't agree more, right? I mean, freedom of speech is everything. I mean, it truly is. Now, I say this both as someone who comes from the Middle East, where that's not an enshrined universal value, right? Freedom of speech in the Middle East, as has been throughout the entire history of the human condition, is really a consequential thing. Yes, you have freedom of speech, but don't criticize religion X. Yes, you have freedom of speech, but don't criticize dictator Y. Yes, you have, right? And that's why I get upset, by the way, when I see contemporary public intellectuals exactly committing those types of deep moral transgressions, right? Yes, I believe in freedom of speech fully, but surely not for the orange Himmler Donald Trump. Yes, I believe...
Orange Himmler.
Right. Yes, I believe in the presumption of innocence principle in American jurisprudence, but certainly not for gang rapist Brett Kavanaugh. Sure, there is no real evidence that he did any of those things, but we can't take a risk with this guy. And so let's presume that he is guilty, because after all, it's only a job interview, right? Sure, I believe in journalistic integrity, but it was perfectly fine to suppress the Hunter Biden story, because otherwise Orange Himmler would have become president. So you see how in each of those three examples that I just gave, there's a deontological principle that you should always adhere to, but somehow, because you've suddenly become a political tribal person, you're now willing to violate using a consequentialist calculus. This is wrong. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons why when I've gone after some of the folks that we might know in common, I really did it advisedly, because at first I thought, I don't want to burn a bridge with this person. They're a nice person. I went after another person recently, by the way, in a contrary to pragmatic calculus. Let me explain. There's this gentleman who has a very large show, not Joe Rogan level, but one that I certainly would have wanted to get on, given that I am trying to promote my book. So now there is this tug, this pragmatic tug. On the other hand, this gentleman is peddling some full positivity bullshit that's really pissing me off. So am I going to be quiet and pragmatic so that I can get on his show and sell a couple of thousand extra copies? Or am I going to be authentic and say, cut it out? Guess which one I chose?
Cut it out.
Cut it out. But again, then I regret it after, but because I sometimes go after people in a uniquely Gad style, they then get offended. But my purpose was never to offend them individually. It's that I'm attacking their position.
With satire.
With satire. And that can be quite punchy, right? So Neil deGrasse Tyson, I'll mention his name since I don't know him personally. Although the full positivity guy, I also don't know personally. Neil deGrasse Tyson, have you seen his recent famous clip where he's a physicist. So
I've had him on the show.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you don't...
I haven't seen the recent thing, but...
He basically said, look, it's very clear. Gender is on a spectrum. And I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember the exact words, but you could go look it up. I just did a sad truth satire on his whole thing, where he says, look, today I wake up and I feel 80% male. And then I might put on some makeup and then I'm now more female. Right. So already he's saying something insane, which is your maleness or femaleness is defined by the accoutrement that you wear.
Right.
And so I said, okay, well, how can I attack such a ridiculous thing? Through satire. So what I did is, usually if you hear the following words in the Saad household, you know trouble is coming up. I call my daughter and I say, bring the Halloween wigs. When I give that instruction, you know there's going to be trouble. And so I took all the wigs. I looked at the camera and I said, look, I completely agree with Neil deGrasse Tyson because he's super smart because he's a physicist. And so look, now I am 100% male. I am the epitome of manhood. And now watch how I'm going to transition into female as I wear different wigs of different lengths, different colors. And then I put lipstick, either 25% of my lips, 50%, 75 or 100. And so I literally took verbatim what he said and mocked it into oblivion, and it went viral. Now, I didn't do that because I'm a mean guy who is trying to hurt Neil deGrasse Tyson's feelings. But Neil deGrasse Tyson has an obligation. He's a public intellectual who has a large platform. If you're going to go and use your scientific imprimatur to say, it is settled, gender is on a spectrum, I'm coming after you. That's called authenticity.
So now we get into another part of your book, which I think is really important, which is variety. Now you will, and I'm sure we'll talk more about other areas, but one of the areas you say variety becomes important is intellectual.
Oh, yes.
And so this is, and one of the people I think you were making oblique reference to that I'll drag into the light here with love is Sam Harris.
Yes.
So I recently had him on the show.
Yes.
And I disagree with Sam around freedom of speech very much. But I think the way that people are dismissing him is a mistake. And so the reason I think that is because he's grappling with a problem. Again, I think he's come to the wrong conclusion, but he's grappling with a real problem. And I want, because of epistemic humility, my absolute just pervasive not only fear that I'm wrong, I know I am frequently wrong.
Right.
And so I want challenges to my ideas, which you also talk about in the book. Again, guys, this is a book about happiness, but you're really giving a value stack that I think is critical for people to work through in their own lives in order to actually make this real. You're talking about people really do have to understand, you have to want to be challenged. That's going to be the thing that makes you stronger. You have to want intellectual, even variety in your life. And so where this gets very difficult, I think Sam is being authentic. So for him to look himself in the mirror, even though from the outside I look at it and go, Sam, that's a wrong conclusion. Not only is it wrong, it's dangerous, but he's on the opposite side of that intuition saying, Tom, not only have you come to the wrong conclusion, but it's dangerous. And so the problem he's dealing with, I think, these are not his words, this is my interpretation. What he's dealing with is the realities of a world driven by algorithm where ideas have extreme velocity.
Right.
And they're all crushed down into memes. So there's no more depth, there's no more nuance. It's headline that is fed to you algorithmically, so you're being manipulated and you don't even know it. And the ideas come at you so fast that even if you're smart, you're not going to be able to hold a nuanced position on that thing. You don't have time to think through all of the ideas. And so in grappling with that, again, I don't agree with his conclusion, but I really think he's approaching the problem sincerely.
I do think that he's authentic. So contrary to the full positivity guy, who I think is putting on kind of
I think I know who you're talking about, but I don't know him.
Right. I don't know him either personally.
I don't know if
It almost can't be that a functioning adult can spew some of the vacuous platitudes that he puts out on his Twitter feed. It's impossible.
You can reboot your life, your health, even your career, anything you want All you need is discipline. I can teach you the tactics that I learned while growing a billion-dollar business that will allow you to see your goals through. Whether you want better health, stronger relationships, a more successful career, any of that is possible with the mindset and business programs in Impact Theory University. Join the thousands of students who have already accomplished amazing things. Tap now for a free trial and get started today.
We can conquer war through love. Oh, geez, if only the Nazis had been more loving, then we wouldn't have had it. You know,
Okay, that's ridiculous, I admit. But here,
Okay.
you have to anchor to something,
yeah,
right? So, for instance, when I had Neil deGrasse Tyson on the show, he said, I don't think I'm right for your show. And I was like, whoa, why? And he was like, you're trying to bend everything to empowerment. And I was like, these are not the actual words he used, but this is the punchline. And he was right. And so, but I'm not being fake. But at the same time, it forced the interview into an angle. So I think, look, we're talking about Lex Friedman.
yes,
I think. Okay.
yes,
So do not know him, have never met
Yes.
him. Do I think that he owns a position that puts him into, at times he's being silly and naive, but I fall into the same bucket of trying to make things like you can take control and you can find your way out. So I understand how I'm just as guilty of something. So if I look at my own behavior, I'm like, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to anchor my life. I need a way to think about the world. I need a way to organize the complexity. So just as my eyes don't go, there's 17,000 photons in this wavelength bouncing off of that quarter inch of thing, it just goes, that's gray, that's blue, right? And so, now I can deal with the world. We all need an orienting mechanism.
Yeah.
Now, if all of us go, there's limitations to my orienting mechanism, and I have to distrust myself, then you probably are in better shape. And I will speak for myself. If you made fun of one of my ideas through satire, one, I'd be like, I made it. And then two, I'd be like, it does sting, man, I won't lie.
yeah,
But at the same time, it's kind of how I think about Dave Chappelle when he makes fun of white people.
right.
I'm like, Dave Chappelle is one of the most insightful people I've ever seen in my life. Never met him, but oh dear God, do I think that we need him? And so I'm like, word, like I find it funny.
But that's what anti-fragility is, right? I mean, yes, Nassim Taleb is the guy who kind of popularized that term, but the concept of anti-fragility exists since the time of certainly Seneca. So I have in one of the chapters of the Happiness book, I have an epigraph from Seneca where he basically argues that strong trees and that have deep roots are precisely those that have been exposed to severe wind stressors. That's why they then become non-brittle. Trees that haven't been exposed to wind stressors then break off very easily. Well, of course, that anti-fragility concept, squeaky doors don't break, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger, those concepts, those maxims apply to your ideas being scrutinized, right? So, for example, when I went after Sam Harris's ideas, or when I go after the full positivity of Lex Friedman, in my view, someone with testicular fortitude would basically say, hey, Gad, why don't you come on my show and let's hash it out? Or, hey, why don't I come on your show?
Facts.
Because, there has never been a context where I've said something and that I wasn't willing to stand by it. Because for better or worse, when I say something, good luck to you if you want to debate me on it, because I just like you, I have epistemic humility. I'm very modulated about what I know and what I don't know. When I know something, I walk with the swagger of someone who knows it. But there's a million things that I know almost nothing about. So if you ask me, what has been the repercussions of the legalization of marijuana in Canada? You know, you're Canadian. What do you think? You know what, Tom? I know very little about this. I'm not going to try to wing it. I simply don't know enough to offer you an intelligent answer. But if you take the positions that some of these gentlemen or other gentlemen have taken in the public sphere, then expect guys like me to say, I'm calling you out on it. Now, someone with strength, with a spine says, let's hash it out. But then when you block me and all this kind of stuff, people thought, oh, I'm hurt. I don't care if you block me or not. What it does to me, it's a dishonorable act. It comes from my Middle Eastern background, perhaps, right? You don't block, you fight. I fight not physically, you fight the ideas. And so, and to go back to happiness, the reason why people say, you always seem to be, twinkle in your eye, you always smile, because I'm confident within my personhood. There are no fissures in Gad. So even though I'm not a tall person, I walk as though I'm 15 feet tall. Why? Because I exactly don't have to remember 73 stories. There's only one story I remember. It's called the truth. And so that's why I think truth and freedom are so fundamental, not just as an existential philosophical thing, but to my flourishing, to my happiness, to why I'm smiling all the time, because I have a non-fractured personhood.
That's really, really important. Okay, so here's truth and freedom, which were not on my list of things to talk about, I think are going to become very important as we march forward. So here's my fear. Truth is slippery. It's actually surprisingly difficult to define and to agree on what is true.
And you're sounding like a postmodernist. You're
yeah. So follow me. So this is where it's grabbing a hold of when people identify the wrong answer to a hard problem. It's still worth going. Are they well-meaning people? Now, if they're not well-intentioned people, okay, now we have to address that thing. And I think postmodernists don't make sense to me until I think about the will to power. Once I frame them with will to power, then I understand them. And I use a mental exercise. So my background is filmmaking, so I often think as a writer. And I think, okay, what would for this character to act this way, what would need to be true about their backstory or their motivations? Sure. When I write them from the perspective of this is somebody who's deeply insecure and they have a will to power, suddenly click, everything makes sense and I can predict their behaviors. So that one I'll set aside. But I will say that I get how they end up stacking that argument up, and I get how a potentially well-meaning person ends up there, especially with the complexities of the human experience, where it's like, you do want to be cool and you do want to rise up the ranks, and you may not even put words to, oh, the way for me to climb up the hierarchy is by playing this linguistic or laying a linguistic trap that I know people will walk into, and now I can leapfrog them. And you really don't think about the second and third order consequences of what happens to a society when you do that. And even if you do, you probably think that you're one of the prison guards instead of the prisoners. And so
that's a Zimbardo reference?
I don't know who that is. No, that was a...
prisoner. So there was a famous experiment in the 70s conducted by a Stanford professor. Where he was studying obedience to expected norms.
Terrifying.
And so half the students were placed as corrections officers, the other were placed as prisoners. And then what ended up happening is that the officers assumed their roles so, assiduously that he had to end the experiment. So I thought that's what you were referring to.
No, I was unfortunately referring to the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. That book changed me fundamentally. You can actually track in the timeline of guests that I bring on and questions that I ask, you can see the demarcation point of having read that book.
Wow.
Because it was like, oh shit, people end up as the guards. They don't end up as the person hiding Anne Frank in the attic, right? Yeah. So it's like, yikes, that was a terrifying realization about how easy it would be for me to just like not want to be tortured. Yeah. So I do the torturing, which is why my opening question about facing that. So anyway, back to truth.
Yeah.
So you have this thing. I think it is difficult to define. I think it is very hard. So if truth and freedom are you can't get to a eudaimonic state where it's fulfillment, it's a depth of thing about living the good life without defining those.
Right.
How did you define it?
So it depends. If you're talking in the scientific context, not in the happiness context, which is for the current book. So I do actually have a chapter in my last book, The Parasitic Mind, titled How to Seek Truth. I mean, literally, that's the title. And there's a distinction between two types of truths. There are axiomatic truths. Those are mathematical truths, right? So there's a mathematical property, and within the closed system of that mathematical system, something is true or false, right? So mathematical logic operates using truth and false statements, okay? How about empirical truths, right? So how do we know, when is it that we've acquired enough empirical evidence to say that something appears to be true, even though even there it is provisionally true? Because in science, we always talk about provisional truth. If in 300 years you falsify the position that we held to be true for 300 years, then it's back to the drawing board, okay?
Right.
And so so this is in the Parasitic Mind, not in the Happiness book. I talk about the building of nomological networks of cumulative evidence, which is a mouthful.
Nomological?
Yes, nomological
What does that
network.
mean?
So it's where you are creating triangulation of evidence stemming from many different distinct lines of evidence, which then demonstrates that your position is unassailable. This sounds very abstract, so let me give it with this concrete example. Let's suppose I wanted to prove to you, Tom, that the sex specificity of toy preferences is universal. It's not a social construction. Typically, social scientists view toy preferences as a social construction. Mommy and daddy teach Johnny to play with the blue truck. They teach Linda to play with the pink Barbie, in light of the current movie. And that's what starts us on a cascade of gender role specialization. Okay. The opposite viewpoint is that these toy preferences are actually universal for specific biological and evolutionary reasons. So if I wanted to prove to you that it is not social construction, how would I go about doing that? So I'm going to build you now in front of your audience a nomological network of cumulative evidence that's going to make it very difficult for you to argue away from that position. Okay. I'm going to get you data from around the world, very, very different cultures, that show that people with radically different environments adhere to those sex-specific toy preferences. Now, that's already pretty compelling, but I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to get you data from developmental psychology, whereby I take children who are too young to be socialized, by definition. In other words, they haven't yet reached the cognitive developmental stage to learn, and I could show you that they already exhibit the penchant for either trucks or dolls. Now, already there, I'm putting the epistemological noose around your neck, but I'm not going to stop there. The nomological network is going to be much bigger. It's going to be a tsunami that's going to hit you. I'm going to get you data from comparative psychology. Comparative psychology is where you demonstrate the universality of a phenomenon across different species. What if I get you data from vervet monkeys, from rhesus monkeys, and from chimpanzees that shows that they exhibit the same sex-specific toy preferences that human infants do? So now let's step back. I've gotten you data from across cultures, from across species, from developmental psychology, but I'm not going to stop there. How about I get you data from 2,000 years ago, where on mausoleums in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, little boys and girls were shown playing with exactly the same sex-specific toy preferences we have today. Now I'm showing you that it's across time. Not satisfied yet? How about I hit you with pediatric endocrinology? Little girls who suffer from congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is a endocrinological disorder that maximizes their behavior. What do you think happens to their toy preferences? They become like those of little boys. So now I've gotten you data from pediatrics and medicine. So you see how I'm hitting you with different lines of evidence. I'm building a nomological network, and it's going to be very hard for you to argue away. That's what allows me to walk into a room of 400 social scientist imbeciles and to be able to walk with this swagger because I've done my homework. On the other hand, you ask me about legalization of marijuana. What do I say? I haven't built a nomological network for that. I don't know enough about that, Tom. So you got me there. I don't wing it. I don't fake it. I don't pretend that I'm the professor who's all-knowing. I know what I know, and I know what I don't know. Confucius said that already. So that epistemic humility, in a sense, in a circuitous way, allows me to be happy in a philosophical sense because I'm never questioning what I said yesterday or tomorrow. I'm very authentic. I present myself to the world, take it or leave it.
Wow, that was a very compelling argument and helps myself and anybody trying to understand how you end up building that web of truth. Now, there's another thing. So I will routinely make my expert guests deeply uncomfortable by asking them questions that are outside their field. And of course, their initial answer is marijuana. I don't know about that. Sorry, I can't give you any data. But what I'm always curious in is how people approach novel problems.
Sure.
So I used to teach a business class called Business Decision Making. Worst name ever. My
By the way,
fault. I chose it.
You know that my doctoral dissertation is in psychology of decision
Of
making.
course I know that. Come
Okay,
on,
great.
Gad Saad.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm so fascinated by your background. I know it well. So that class, that was me trying to work backwards to what has made me a successful entrepreneur. And the answer wasn't that I was the best copywriter. It wasn't that I was the best salesperson. It wasn't that I was the best at organizing things. It was that I understand how to solve novel problems. So not just problems that I've never seen before, problems nobody's ever seen before. So how do you approach that? How do you think through it? Now, that does not mean that I always make the right decision. I absolutely do not. But part of my process is understanding how to learn from mistakes, something I call the physics of progress. But how do you, so you get nomological, we've got unlocked. That was incredible. Now, what do you do when you approach a problem you've never seen before, no one's ever seen before, but it still has to be dealt with?
Phenomenal question. It speaks to something that you mentioned earlier, but then we skipped by it when you talked about intellectual variety seeking. So I have a chapter on variety seeking. I talk about food variety seeking, sexual variety seeking.
We'll talk about that.
Exercise variety seeking, and probably the section that I spent the most time on was intellectual variety seeking. And I'm going to come to your question about the novel situations. So there I contrast the specialist to the generalist. The idea is, so let's say in academia, and we talked about this briefly before I came on the show. Academia rewards hyper specialists. You stay in your lane, you know a lot about a very, very small problem. Don't ever step out of the lane. But the truly biggest thinkers are exactly those that violate that tenet, are the ones who are polymaths in their core being. And so one of the things that I talk about in that section, I have this exercise of who are the 10 historical figures that you'd like to have dinner with if you could bring them. And I list all mine and why. And the number one guy, the guy that I would most want, I don't obviously know what his personality would be like, but based on what he presented to the world, is Leonardo da Vinci. Because Leonardo da Vinci is the ultimate generalist. He is a painter of great renown. He's an anatomist, he's a futurist, he's an engineer, he's a scientist. So he's wearing many hats. And so I don't think you can solve some of the most important novel problems if they're not at the cusp of interdisciplinarity. The mapping of the human genome required experts in many, many different fields putting their brains together as a supra brain. And it's that the multitude, the buffet of expertise that allowed us to crack the human genome. So in my own academic career, I've to a fault violated the stay in your lane tenet, because I've had universities, some of them very prestigious universities, who were quite keen on hiring me. And then the thing that ended it, other than me being rather irreverent and rather not gentle spoken, is the fact that they said, your CV is all over the place. You don't seem to have a unifying, area of research. Well, actually, that's wrong, because what is usually unifying across all my various studies is the evolutionary lens. Now, it is true that I've published in medicine, in politics, in advertising, in decision-making, in bibliometrics, but typically, for each of those various disciplines, I'm infusing some evolutionary angle. So they thought of it as scattered. I think of it as, the ultimate polymath generalist. And so I don't think you can really crack some of those novel problems if you don't have, here's another term you're going to like, if you don't have a consilient synthetic way of thinking. Consilience is a term that was reintroduced into the lexicon by E.O. Wilson, who's the Harvard biologist who recently passed away. A great book, by the way. I recommend for all your readers to read it after they buy The Sad Truth About Happiness. The book is called Consilience, Unity of Knowledge. Consilience basically means, well, exactly that, unity of knowledge. So physics is more consilient than sociology. Not because physicists are smarter than sociologists, but it's because physicists have a tree of knowledge that is coherent. They all agree on some fundamentals. Whereas in sociology, we can't agree on what's man or woman. Then there's going to be very quickly a bifurcation in our worldviews if we can't agree on that fundamental fact. So having a consilient mindset, being a generalist, in my view, are probably the best ways to crack novel problems.
Wow. Okay. That's really interesting. You're right that I love that consilient idea. I had not thought about that. You've also introduced, I think, one of the things that maybe I find most uneasy about the fact that there's this bedrock thing that my generation grew up, I didn't even think about it. It was the most obvious bifurcation was men and women, and there were so many things. And so, boys and girls, one thing that will lead to happiness, I'll be very curious to see if you disagree with this, is your ability to predict the future accurately. And I think our brains are a prediction engine. That's what makes it so valuable. That's what it's optimized for. And whether that's predicting movement, and maybe that's how it all started, but certainly its predictive abilities go way beyond that. The thing that you have said is most important. There are two things in your book. You say marriage, getting your spouse right, and then getting your work right.
Yes.
And if you get the main love of your life and your career, if you do those well, then you're golden. And to that point, the reason I'm very uneasy about the world not being able to agree on what a man and woman is that I've been married for 21 years. It is by far the greatest joy of my life. And I'm talking, I've made a lot of fucking money. And I'm just here to tell you, as powerful as money is, it will not bring to your life what
Amen.
a thriving marriage will. Not
Amen.
in a million years. So my wife becomes predictable to me when I think of her in classic feminine ways. And she becomes unpredictable to me when I think she's like me. And at the beginning of our marriage, it was very confusing because I didn't think about it. So I just assumed that she was like me. So I did not have the consilience, is that the word, of knowledge at the time, and was blind to the fact that I didn't have that. And so there was so much friction. And a lot of that friction has worked out over time by literally spending research hours on what are the differences between men and women.
Right.
And as the two of us did that, we were like, oh my God, that's why you act like that. And it just became so much easier to deal with.
So there's a famous scene in King of Queens. I don't know if you remember. Do you remember that sitcom?
Never watched it, but I know it.
It's basically kind of this affable blue collar guy, Kevin James. He's married to Leah Remini.
Yes.
Is that the former Remini? Is that how you pronounce it?
Former Scientologist? I don't know.
That's right.
I think
Exactly.
that's how it's said.
And they're having a fight because she has a friend, or I don't know the exact details, but there's this chef. He's a portly fellow. He likes to eat a lot. There's this friend who's a chef who's cooking him all these meals. So he's chatting with her on the phone. She's cooking him meals at work, whatever it is. This is the friend. Leah Remen,
Whichever.
gets jealous, and they're now fighting about the fact that he says, but I'm not having sex with her. I'm not being unfaithful to you. And she says, of course you are being unfaithful to me. So now they have a big fight as to what constitutes infidelity. Now, let me bring evolutionary psychology into this, because as I watched that episode, I could literally link every word that's mentioned from the script writers to a fundamental evolutionary principle. I discussed this actually in my 2011 book, The Consuming Instinct. So there's great studies that show that men and women, to your point about understanding these differences, are equally romantically jealous. So it's not that men are more jealous than women or vice versa. But here's the evolutionary insight. The trigger is different for men and women. There are two types of infidelities. There's sexual infidelity and there is emotional infidelity. So if I bring in people into the lab, and by the way, the study that I'm describing was done by David Buss and his colleagues, who's a pioneer of evolutionary psychology and a good friend of mine, who actually wrote the preface of The Consuming Instinct. You bring in people into the lab and you actually put physiological measures on them so that you know that it's an autonomic response that you're measuring. It's not that they are altering their answer for impression management or whatever. So you can do skin conductivity thing, you can do heart, blood pressure, you can do, there's all kinds of ways you can measure autonomic responses. And now I'm going to read you one of two vignettes about your partner, your husband or wife. Let's do both, irrespective of whether it's for a man or a woman. You're sitting right here in the lab, Tom. Your wife is having some really juicy sex with the super sexy Greek gardener. Mull that in your little head for a while. Now let's see the stress level. Or, hey Tom, so now this is the emotional infidelity. Hey Tom, your wife goes to lunch with her colleague, who's this really fun, affable guy. They joke around, they talk about their shared values. So it's emotional, absolutely no sex. Guess what happens to the difference between men and women? Men respond much more harshly when cued with sexual infidelity. Women respond much more harshly with emotional infidelity.
That's so crazy to me.
That is why I am the Godfather. Okay. So now, why is that? What's the evolutionary reason? The greatest threat to a man's evolutionary interest is paternity uncertainty. Therefore, the thought of my wife going with another man, we're a biparental species. I don't like the idea of being cuckolded. Therefore, I've evolved the emotional, cognitive, and behavioral systems to really respond harshly to sexual territoriality infractions. On the other hand, for women, not that they are terribly pleased if you cheat on them sexually, but they're more displeased if you cheat on them emotionally, because that is a greater predictor. You mentioned earlier, I want to predict it. That is a greater predictor of the likelihood of your man packing his bags and leaving, either literally or metaphorically, okay? Right. And therefore, that's why, by the way, when a man often cheats on a woman and now he's trying to assuage her anger, what does he say?
It meant nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. It meant nothing. I don't even remember her name. I'll never see her again. Why? Because he is assuaging the fact this is not a repeat thing. There's no chance there could ever be any emotional entanglement involved here. So this gives you an example, number one, of the value of evolutionary psychology, and the value of something as practical as why men and women so often speak in completely non-intersecting ways, because we're not using theory of mind with the other sex, right? So for example, when men send, if you forgive the term, dick pics to women, they are exactly engaging in a violation of theory of mind. Because what are they doing? They're saying, I get titillated by visual stimuli. Therefore, it must be the case that women are titillated in exactly the same way. Guess what, Einstein? They're not.
Do you know how badly I want my wife to want me to send her dick pics? It's so, I feel dumb because I know that she doesn't, but I can't help wanting her to want me to do it. I know better, so I don't. But like, yeah, I get it. I get it.
So that, by the way, when I lecture to my university students about, first class, why am I going to teach this whole course using an evolutionary lens? I usually will come up with a few of these examples. Like, they're all young people that have boyfriends and girlfriends where they get jealous. And so that's how I grip them, because I explain to them that it's not, understanding evolutionary theory is not some highfalutin, scientific thing that is void of practical value. It allows me to understand why people want the corner big office. It allows me to understand. I always tell them, I guarantee you there'll be 3-4 people in this room that in the next 2-3 years will send me an email saying, oh, I just had a fight with my husband and wife, and it's exactly because of lecture 3 from your course. I remember you said about romantic. So that, and I guess that speaks a bit to the next book that I might be writing, the power of evolutionary thinking.
No, huge. Okay, so wrapping up on variety of ideas, what is it about variety that matters? Because it isn't just challenging your own ideas. It's also, in the book, you talk about the most eminent scientists will have the broadest interests outside of their field.
Exactly.
So what's at play?
Well, because that is a proxy measure of them having that mindset of consilience, right? I can both be a photographer and a Nobel Prize winner in what I have multiple. So for example, let's give a concrete example. Analogical reasoning,
Analogical?
analogical,
Like from analogy?
yeah, the ability to draw analogies to demonstrate a mechanism is actually often an important scientific tool. You're much less likely to be able to do analogical reasoning well if you're not someone who has multiple interests. Because by definition, once I have multiple interests, I'm able to analogize from domain A to domain B, hence allowing me to build bridges between these otherwise disparate areas, right? And so I can connect many parts by being able to have that synthetic mindset. And so from a practical perspective, having a penchant for intellectual variety seeking makes sense. But just from the banal perspective of the number of ecosystems that I would like to visit in my life, there's a million buffet dishes of intellectual pursuits that I'd like to navigate. I don't want to just be the very narrow guy. Now, there are very clear practical reasons why researchers are very narrow, because it allows them to build economies of scale. I already have the methodology set up to run these studies ad infinitum. I already know the literature really well. It's very hard for me when I want to publish a paper, as I did on sex differences in OCD and why that has an evolutionary signature. Well, now I have to do the hard work. I'm not an OCD researcher. That's not my area of specialty. Now I have to get uncomfortable in going to learn a whole new area to hopefully have the chutzpah to contribute to that field. But guess what? Life is exciting that way. I'm sampling from many, many dishes of intellectual spaces. And so just from that perspective, it's so much more exciting, which, by the way, links up to another chapter in the book, which is the title of the chapter is Life as a Playground, right? It's everything is play, right? Science itself is the highest form of play. What is science? It's puzzle making, right? There's a bunch of variables. I don't know which ones cause which other ones. And now let's have fun and figure out the story here. You were mentioning you love stories, right? Well, we are a storytelling animal, and science is telling a compelling story using evidence to back it up. So having that playful mindset, sometimes being humorous, sometimes being variety seeker, sometimes being sarcastic, life is so much poorer if you don't have that mindset.
Play is very interesting, but there's also something that's tickling in my mind about what you were talking about in terms of having a broad set of interests that I want to see if I can pull this out. So we've got the ability to make cross connections, and if I'm not mistaken, the only people that have won multiple Nobel Prizes have always been at the intersection of two different disciplines. Like they've been a biologist and a chemist or something like that. I'm not sure. Do you know
Not
that
exactly that. It is true that many of the biggest breakthroughs in science happen at the intersection of disciplines. I think what you're referring to is what you mentioned earlier, which is Nobel Prize winners on average have greater number of broad interests than non-Nobel Prize winners. In other words, there is something unique about the broadness of interest that Nobel laureates have outside their areas of expertise. They're also photographers. They also love ceramics. They also take tango classes. Richard Feynman was a bongo player. And so they're not just these geeks that only know this one little thing.
Yeah, I'm not even sure yet what I'm trying to piece together, but I have a feeling, and it could be tied to the playfulness, but even thinking about my own life, that because I have multiple areas of interest, there's something about the way that they have a similar response that I get when I'm meditating. It's a similar response that I think people get when they do psychedelic drugs, that is very tied to this idea of you have a better ability to think in analogy. And it's when I think of why meditation works, it puts you in a calm and creative state. But that's not interesting in and of itself. It's only interesting because areas of my brain that normally would not connect begin connecting.
Right.
And when you're able to draw on a bunch of areas where, I mean, maybe not a full-blown expert, but you've got some pretty deep experience. You've encountered other minds. You've encountered other ways of thinking about the problem that are sometimes radically different. You're able to really take the 3D object that is our lives is not, that's definitely an analogy. I don't mean that literally, but you're rotating it and now looking at it from a completely different
Yes.
angle. And if you've ever seen those shadow sculptures that are made up of like 1,000 what look like pieces of junk, and then you move the light and suddenly it creates a shadow that's like a person's face, or it may even become a sculpture of the person's face when seen from one angle, a different angle. And that feels like part of the puzzle. And that is certainly part of my addiction to learning new things. And maybe it just comes back to your nomological
You're right.
sense. So recently I have found a new passion, which is history, which literally until, I don't know, maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, I didn't think about at all. And now all of a sudden,
Which type of history? Is it American history? Is it European history?
it's been more about my anchor was trying to understand how wrong bad ideas go. So this started with, I had an awakening to wokeness, which you and I were talking about before we started rolling. So it completely caught me off guard. I didn't know it was a thing until it was fully baked.
Right.
And so I encountered it in its final Pokemon form, and it took me so off guard. I was like, what the fuck is this? It was completely disorienting. And so it was like that moment where I'm seeing the entire world now from a totally different perspective that I did not even know existed. And so I was like, huh. And I didn't have, to your point, if somebody had asked me, like, why does it unnerve you that gender is a spectrum? Like, why do you have like an uneasy feeling when somebody says that? Because I don't have a problem with somebody's transgender. I don't have beef with that. Live your life, do your thing.
Me too.
But yet, when somebody's like, gender is a spectrum, then I'm like, that doesn't sit well with me, and I'm not sure why yet. And so anyway, as I start going down that road, I realize, oh, actually my bigger problem is people saying that I'm bad for questioning that. So my real beef is people saying I can't look at an idea. And so this is all for me, a lot of this really kicked off during COVID. So I also have people telling me I can't question anything about that. So I start to get this really uneasy feeling about, why are people telling me I can't look at ideas? I have just enough stubbornness in me and real problem with authority that I was like, I need to wrap my head around what this is, because I'm being hit with ideas that are too subtle and I don't know how to combat them. Obviously, you discover Jordan Peterson as you go on this journey. And so I start looking at, he was the one that introduced me to the Gulag Archipelago. So I read that and was like, holy shit, you learn about Mao, you read about Mao, then you just start thinking about humans very differently. So anyway, it's been things like that. So I haven't targeted a given area. At first, it was just learning about Mao, Stalin, and Hitler, and like really getting my head around that. And then the American West, and like how people can kill and not seem to have a problem with it. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to a very simple question.
I'm going to tie a few of these things together.
Please.
So we were talking earlier about, how you can incorporate evolutionary thinking in many different disciplines. So there is a very, very small group of people who are called Darwinian historians, whereby they study historical realities using a Darwinian lens. You follow what I mean?
Yep.
Now, what would be an example of that? So there is a woman called Laura Betzik, who is a Darwinian historian, one of the few who could call herself that, where she did a study, a content analysis of the Old Testament, which is a historical document, where she wanted to demonstrate that the content of the Old Testament contains certain fundamental evolutionary principles. So what did she do? So we know from evolutionary theory and just from life in general that one of the ways that men, the main way that men vary in terms of their sexual opportunities is their social status. All other things equal, the higher my social status, the more sexual opportunities I have, okay? Because that is the universal attribute that women seek most often, irrespective of the culture and irrespective of the fact that the way that social status is measured varies across cultures. In one culture, it might be the number of cattle that I have. In the other culture, it might be that I have an Ivy League degree. In another one, it might be that I have how many zeros I have in the bank account. But what is clear is that no woman has ever said, give me an apathetic, pear-shaped, nasal-voiced, unemployed guy. Let's have sex. I'm really turned on.
That's
okay?
the guy.
That's the guy, okay? So what she wanted to demonstrate in doing a content analysis of the Old Testament is that if you look at male protagonists in the Old Testament and you code their status, they're a king, they're a prophet, they're a general, they're a soldier, they're a farmer, they're a slave, and then calculate how many women or concubines or wives are attributed to them, you should exactly see that the higher the status of the male protagonist in the Old Testament, the more women he has. And guess what? That's exactly what she found. So in this case, she's looking at arguably the most important historical document in Judeo-Christian tradition, and she's applying a Darwinian lens, which speaks to our earlier discussion when I talked about Darwinian literary criticism, which is looking at actual documents, conducting an analysis of those documents, say literature, using an evolutionary lens. So that's the reason why I love evolutionary psychology so much, because once you learn the coherence, the parsimony, the explanatory power that the framework gives you, you're done, man. You've solved all the world's problems. At least you can explain all of the phenomena.
That's really interesting. So bringing this back to how we ended up here, which is the idea of new perspectives, as you get a wider body of knowledge, you're able to see things from a different perspective. Once you can line up those perspectives, now all of a sudden you can rotate the object however you want to see things from a given lens. That's very useful in terms of understanding other people. And there's really two ways, I think, incessantly about what I want this show to be and what I want people to take away and what the unifying factor is, which either on camera or off, I may try to persuade you to try to bring more unity to your brand, is one, I don't want to get trapped in an oversimplification. Two, I really want to be exploring different things, different perspectives. The reason I want to explore different perspectives is so I can see life, the beautiful game of life, from as many different angles as I can. One, so that I can't be controlled by it. So, the Matrix has you kind of thing. If you understand the Matrix and how it works, then you can, in a metaphor, you can manipulate it to your will. In reality, you can get close to the idea of a reality distortion field where you're not really sort of changing the construct of the Matrix, but when somebody's been parasitized by an idea, it doesn't have to infect you because you understand how ideas come to be. And so helping myself and then letting the audience go along for the journey of, oh, here's a new perspective to look at this thing from, to your idea of nomological thinking. It's very interesting. So understanding other people and understanding how the world works. And by understanding others, you will understand yourself, which is where this whole interview started.
But by the way, as someone who studies decision-making, I end up being horrible at making certain decisions, notwithstanding that, how they say physicians heal thyself.
Right.
So linking what I'm about to say to knowledge. So one of the most perplexing situations in terms of my experiencing choice paralysis happens in the following situation. My wife and I and kids are, let's say, leaving on a trip. Therefore, I know I have to pick a book or two to bring with me on vacation.
I empathize with this so hard, I'm going to get a cramp.
Is that really?
100%.
So my wife will look at me and say, "We're leaving in 2 days. Please begin your agony," because I will sit like a complete homeless guy in my study because I've got hundreds of books that I've yet to read. And I just keep going through all of them saying, oh, maybe I think it's this one. No, I think it's this. I think this is the one. And then I start panicking about the fact that there is so much knowledge only in that room that I've yet. So imagine whatever knowledge I have right now, however little or much it is, there is so little that I know compared to what I could know. And then I have this really difficult, anxious moment. And then I pick a few books. Maybe you want to ask me which books I picked for this trip?
Please.
So I brought a book by Edith Hall, who's a classicist.
How do I know that name?
She's a classicist and there's a book on Aristotle that I'm reading.
Definitely not why I know her. Okay.
That's not how you know her?
Definitely not. I wish I did.
Okay.
I've never read a book on Aristotle.
I brought another book that's by a libertarian. I can't remember the name of the book, but it's basically kind of government, stay away out of my business. I'm uniquely attracted to that topic because I don't
We're
like.
going to get to that part of the interview.
Oh, let's do it. But just to finish that point, I don't like some 21-year-old cop sitting, lying in wait in my residential neighborhood to make sure that I didn't cross the street when the sign didn't say to cross, when there aren't any cars around and it's a one-way street. And I think I've got the neuronal power to be able to look and see there is no car so I can cross. Yet he's hiding there. And if I cross when this thing didn't say, he either gives me a warning or asks for my ID and gives me a jaywalking ticket. That's not how I want society to be organized. And so I was actually, this is a real story that pissed me off. And so I got this book because I want to read what this guy is talking about in terms of libertarianism. So those are the two books I brought.
Yeah, that's that I really get that. So for me, when I go away on trips, it's the only time in the year that I'll read a fiction book. And so
That's one more time than me, by the way.
That's interesting. So you never
And I recognize that that's a fault because there is tons of amazing classic stuff that I would be enriched by that's completely invisible to me because I just have a strong aversion to reading fiction. Maybe you can help me.
Well, let me walk you through my decision-making process. So as a kid, it was the only thing I would read. And so it opened me up to that world. I owe, and I know that this is not going to be a name you love, but I owe Stephen King a debt of gratitude. And he is the reason I read. And reading changed my life.
Yes.
And I still remember the opening line of the first book that I read by him. That was
Carrie?
No.
Okay.
The first book was The Gunslinger, the Dark Tower series. And my dad made an appeal to me because I said, I'm never reading another book. This is garbage. I don't know why people do this or like this. And he said, look, I'm going to recommend one more book. If you don't like this book, I'll never bother you again. Yeah. And so he gave me that book. From the first line, I was like, holy shit, this is interesting. So that changed my life. So for a long time, it was just fiction. And then I got to the point where you've given me such a cool way to understand what I've been chasing all these years with nomatological. Is that the right word?
Nomological.
Nomological. Thank you. I'll listen to the interview over and I will eventually learn this word. So the being able to really see the problem from a lot of different perspectives. And the way I always explained it to people is I read in swarms. And so I'll pick a topic and I'll try to see it from all different angles. And that I realized the density of information in a nonfiction book comes so rapid that I just couldn't bring myself to read fiction anymore because it was so slow. You get an insight, but the book usually takes one topic, explores it like a theme, and then you get their take on the theme. But just the density of information isn't there. And so I eschewed it for probably more than a decade. And then I might have been at my wife's encouraging. She was like, we're going on vacation. Why don't you take a fiction book? Because you're sort of lamenting that you never read fiction anymore. Why don't you take it? And so I did, and I found it incredible. And because in vacation, I'm not in a, I need the information to come fast. I just want to relax and enjoy something. Right. Then I can enjoy it, but I can't enjoy it the rest of the time.
Wow.
And so, but on vacation, I will read one fiction book and it's a joy.
Please email me after the show your 5 books that you think I must be reading in fiction world.
The bad news is I read so little fiction. All I can do is recommend the ones I liked, which you may hate, but I will happily.
Okay.
So I don't know that I made a great pitch for why you should be reading more fiction, but that's
I'll make a pitch for why I should be reading more
Please.
fiction. So we touched upon this before we started rolling. So the field of Darwinian literary criticism argues that the reason why we love literature so much and it grips us and it titillates us is because it is typically covering a set of fundamental evolutionary imperatives. And we discussed those earlier, right? Parent-child conflict, sexual jealousy, paternity uncertainty, the stuff of life, the evolutionary dramas. And so I think that there are ways for me as an evolutionist to see these mechanisms at play when it's encapsulated in a powerful story. We are a storytelling animal, so why don't I look for some of these evolutionary signatures in a great piece of literature? So that would be my pitch as to why I should be reading more fiction.
Yeah, deep look into the human condition.
Yeah.
One book I really want to read, not books, I don't even know which books he wrote, but Dostoevsky is someone, I just hear people that I respect so
I did read, so about 25 years ago, knowing myself and my weaknesses, knowing that I don't nearly know enough fiction as I should, considering myself a well-read person, I said, I'm going to read Crime and Punishment. I bought it, and I probably got through a third of it. And I didn't stop because I got bored,
Right.
just because something else grabbed my interest. So it's interesting that you mentioned Dostoevsky, because I really tried to go after him.
Yeah, that's one I would regret if I never read the sort of greats, especially of, for whatever reason, they have a reputation, because I cannot vouch for it, but Russian literature, I mean, when you talk to people like, what are those game-changing looks at humanity,
Yeah.
which you're absolutely right about what makes reading fiction interesting, is that those guys come up over and over.
What do you have any speculative reasons as to why you think the Russian authors are uniquely capable at generating that literature?
So we are now at your version of not knowing about weed legalization in Canada.
Right.
So approaching a novel problem just based on things that I've heard, I'm not even sure that I would have enough information on how to approach it. So if I wanted to go figure out that answer, then I would have to triangulate around the things that I've heard people say. And it's things like they take an unflinching look at the complexities of the human experience.
Interesting.
And so I have a feeling that it's something like, given the conditions of a country that has really struggled with freedoms,
Yes.
that you run into the best and the worst of humanity. You run in, and again, I'm guessing, but this is, if you want to understand how
That's
I
a
think
lot
through,
better answer than I would have given you about legalization of marijuana. So I think you were being quite humble, because that sounded like a professor of literature speaking.
Wow. As the
damn.
Brits would say, I'm blagging it right now. So yeah, that's what I want it to be.
Yeah.
How about that? And if
Yeah.
it is that, then wow, do I really look forward to reading it? Because this goes back to the way that I'm approaching history. Why am I approaching it that way? In fact, I'm gonna maybe at the risk of losing the audience, there's a person I want to talk about. I don't even know who to invite on the show to talk about it. So we'll try it against you.
Okay.
I'm reading a book on Churchill right now, and he is beyond fascinating.
I just watched the movie.
Really? Which
on the
the one
flight.
with Gary Oldman?
Yeah.
Oh, phenomenal.
Just watched it.
Phenomenal. A very small part of what makes him interesting, though.
Right.
To me, so do you know much about his background?
I mean, he was a soldier. He said some pretty frontal things about his disdain for Islam. I know that there are some very
That much
famous.
I don't know about.
There's some very famous quotes that he has about, his aversion to Islam.
Interesting.
And not much else. I don't know much about him.
Okay, so here's what I find interesting. Keeping in mind, I'm sure he has abhorrent beliefs on many things that it would curl my eyelashes.
Right.
I'm not a throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of guy. So reading about his life. So he was even as a young man, he wrote a letter to his mom and he said, I hunger so much to have a reputation for physical bravery that basically I'll do anything. And so he sent himself into war zones. And I'll hear stories about like Americans that go over to fight in the Ukraine. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? Like that people voluntarily like go to another country to fight. I don't, braver than me, like all the accolades, whatever. I just can't imagine. And so reading that was the first time, again, I suddenly had a glimpse into the complexity of the human condition. And I saw a guy who had something he wanted to prove so desperately that he was willing to risk his life. And I was like, whoa, that's interesting. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying it's interesting. And then he becomes a politician in the UK because he really believes in like, wherever you live, you should go for your country. You should believe in your country. And he even said about Hitler, he said, look, I respect that he wants to be a good German and he's proud of his country. Now, nobody thought Hitler was a bigger psychopath and needed to be stopped than Churchill.
Right.
So the fact that he can parse like, hey, it's good. I think it's right that people should be pro their country, even if they're on the losing side. Because he was,
Right.
and I'll get to this in a minute, he fought in World War I.
Right.
He beat the Germans. And obviously would have thought that they were terrible, horrible, but he still understood, like, you should be proud of, where you come from. And so that whole idea was very interesting to me. But so you get this guy, he really believes that you should stand up for your country, goes into politics because he thinks that's going to be the best way that he can serve. He gets put in charge of part of the military, and I forget, it might have even been in or around Lebanon. Oh God.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, I can't swear to it.
So maybe that's where his Islamic aversion comes from, in that region, right?
Maybe. Now we are outside. This is now data, and I can't give you data. I can only give you my interpretation of the man. But anyway, so he has a region that he's in charge of, and he puts a plan together, executes it, and it doesn't work. And so he's now out, and he gets kicked out of that. He's basically out of the government. And he already, I think at that point, wants to be prime minister one day, but he's probably in his early 30s at this point. He doesn't become prime minister, I think, till his 60s.
Right.
So he then is like, how do I earn my way back? This motherfucker has himself sent to the front lines of World War I. Says, I want to be in the literal trenches. And they're like, hold on. You're whatever, a master, sorry, I don't know what his rank was, but it was high. And they were like, that is so unorthodox. Why on earth would you do that? And he said, because that's the honorable thing to do. Right. If I can't serve in the government, I want to be on the front line. I want to be as much in danger as my troops are. And he said he would go on the front lines, and immediately everybody thought he was this brash asshole. And he said within 48 hours, they would be on my team because I was courageous. I would go, like, he said people started being afraid to, other biographers, maybe is a better way, other biographers have said people would start out, like they would be afraid to go on patrol with him because he seemed so unafraid. To your earlier point about there's like an optimal courage, and maybe he was a little bit too far.
Yeah.
And so he would just like talk like, hey, I found a hole in their lines. And people were like, motherfucker, you need to be quiet. And so people said he wouldn't flinch. Like if bombs would go off near him, he doesn't flinch. He would hear a bullet crack next to his head. He wouldn't flinch. And people are like, what are you doing? He's like, the bullet's already gone by. What does ducking now mean, right? I mean, just like really, really insane. So I bring him up as an example of somebody who has horrendous flaws.
Right.
And yet, like, is also incredibly interesting. Yeah. And if people can begin to parse these things out and really begin to understand a new perspective, a new way to look at themselves, to look at the world, becomes very, very interesting. I think you only find some of these perspectives by looking at religion and history. And I think those things, because they're the biggest moments,
right,
they are the things that survive the longest, that there is a glimpse into the complexity of the human condition that I want for everyone. And I accidentally found my way to that in this time of such tremendous uncertainty because of what we were talking about earlier with Sam Harris, the velocity of information, everything being forced into a meme, and just the difficulty there is in holding a nuanced position.
Speaking of religion, you mentioned religion and history. Yesterday, I appeared on a show. I don't know if they'd want me to mention, which, well, I guess I posted already on social media. I didn't know that they were quite religious as a outfit. Now, I'm not someone who's very religious. I'm very much steeped in my Jewish identity, but I'm not, I don't go to synagogue, 25 times a year and so on. But there was an incident but there was something that happened that actually was incredibly touching. So the gentleman who picked me up to drive me to the location, he works at this outfit. It's about an hour and a half away. We're in Newport Beach. About an hour and a half away, picks me up. I do the show and then drives me back to our condo in Newport Beach. He says, do you mind if I pray for you before we leave the car? Now, I'm not someone who typically would have I didn't know exactly what to do. Of course, I want to be respectful. So I said, sure. So he kind of puts his hand and he starts, speaking to, Father, blah, blah. But it was so touching. It was so pure that even though I'm someone who's not particularly religious, I can really appreciate the purity of spirit that this guy had.
I love that.
It was magical, and it didn't suddenly convert me to being a whatever, but that speaks in a sense to tolerating the fact that people can have completely different worldviews, but yet we can truly coexist. And I don't mean that in the full positivity sense. I can attack religion in a quite caustic manner only when religion tries to make claims that are within the realm of science. So if you make a religious claim that I know contradicts a scientific tenet, then I will come after you, not because I hate religious people, but because you're making a religious statement or proposition that I think I know to be false. But the idea that people could be religious, as an evolutionist, I fully understand the fact that the default value for most people is to be religious. It actually takes a clear outlier to be a non-believer. And so I thought that yesterday's brief moment was really special. And when I got home and my wife asked, so how was it? And I told her the story. Her first reaction was, well, how did you react? I mean, it's not, I don't sit and do grace at the table. And so for a guy to put his hand on me and start doing these sort of incantations to God, but in a very pure, lovely way was actually quite beautiful.
I love that, man. I love that. I feel very similar. So I don't believe in God, but I would have a very similar reaction. Like when somebody is being very sincere and they're, pouring love.
Authentic.
Yeah. No, it's really nice. Eric Weinstein. Do you know Eric?
I do. I've been to his house for Shabbat
Yes,
dinner.
me too. That's exactly what I was going to say. So I thought it was such a kind and beautiful act for him to invite my wife and I, and we went like really sincerely. Like, I'm going to approach this as if I were a believer,
Right.
and open my heart up to it. And that's, I think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that feels like his approach, because I don't think he believes in God. God, I hope I'm not misrepresenting that, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't. And so for him, though, to step inside of that ritual, I don't want to speak for him, but for me, there is something very interesting. I'd love to get your take on this. There's something very interesting that if you didn't quote in the book, you certainly have quoted in interviews, which is, I think you're quoting the Bible, I kneel before no man, but I kneel before God.
Yes, that's very much of a Jewish edict. It's the idea that you never abase yourself to a human being, only to God. I love that because I am a very proud person in that. So, for example, we discussed this off air. I recently had a kerfuffle situation in Quebec where I dared make fun of the Quebec accent in a completely jocular, innocent way, and people came after me in ways that are just shockingly vicious.
More death threats.
More death threats.
Another set.
I've never had nearly as many requests to have me fired from my
Really
tenured full professorship because I criticized an accent. But my point is that a lot of people said, well, why are you being stubborn? Why don't you just apologize and move on? I said, but that would attack my sense of dignity. It's not that I am averse to apologizing when I do something wrong, right? I think I mentioned, I don't know if it was on this show, I mentioned that if my dog comes to greet me and I don't pay attention to her, then I'll go and apologize because I was curt to my dog. So it's not that I'm too prideful to ever apologize, but I'm certainly not going to abase myself and kneel to you to placate you when I know that I've done nothing wrong. And so, yes, you're right. I have quoted that powerful line because it's very apt.
But as a non-believer, how do you think about that?
Basically, walk tall. So here I will use a cry to battle that I use in the last chapter of The Parasitic Mind, where I ask people to activate their inner honey badger. And there, the reason why I use the imagery of the honey badger is because the honey badger has been identified as the most ferocious and fierce animal in the animal kingdom.
Those things are crazy.
They're insane. I mean, 6 lions will run away from an animal that's the size of a small dog. Why? Because it is just so ferocious. Well, when I'm saying activate your inner honey badger, I'm not saying be physically violent, but I'm saying that if you have a set of principles that you strongly believe in, and if you think you've got the nomological network that can back you up, don't curl away in a fetal position and suck your thumb and start crying and begging for forgiveness. I have nothing to be forgiven because I made fun of your accent. I've lived in that society for 47 years. I love that society, but I love it so much that I would want that society to be strong enough to be able to withstand some guy going on Joe Rogan and making fun of the auditory sounds that come out when you speak that language. If you're so brittle that you can't handle that, I'm doing you a favor by shining a light on that. And therefore, I'm not going to kneel before you. I'm going to double down and triple down. Not because I'm cantankerous, not because I'm frivolously combative, because I'm defending a principle. I'm being a honey badger.
My wife Lisa struggled profoundly with her gut health and experienced debilitating stomach pain. So I focused my energy on learning everything I could about the human gut. Viome is on the cutting edge of this growing area of study with their at-home gut intelligence test. Just 2 to 3 weeks after sending in your sample, you can see your results on 20 integrative health tests that measure your inflammatory activity, metabolic fitness, and the health of your gut lining. As a special offer to my viewers, Viome is offering $110 off your test. Just go to tryviome.com/impact and use code IMPACT to get the $110 off.
Do you know Tom Segura, the comedian?
I know by name, but I can't put a face to him.
Yeah, I've never met him, but his most recent comedy special, he does something very similar. I guess he said something making fun of people from Louisiana. And in the previous special, and he said he got so much hate mail and like all this stuff. And so he ended up doing a whole bit making fun of them yet again, just doubling down on the idea. Yeah, I get it. Apologies are a whole thing because you do want to be quick to apologize when you realize, fuck yeah, I really shouldn't have done that. But if this is a collision of values where it's like, I understand your position.
Yeah.
I just don't agree with it.
Exactly.
So now I'm not trying to piss you off, but at the same time, I'm not going to apologize.
Bingo. By the way, in the happiness book, I have a section where I actually talk specifically about the right conditions under which you should apologize. And I basically argue, so I use another quote from scripture about, love is humble and so on. The idea that in a successful marriage, you have to have the penchant and ability that when you've done truly something wrong, that you immediately apologize for it. The idea being that if you're too prideful to ever apologize, that will eventually probably bring the end to your marriage. Because here's what happens. I speak to you, you and I are married. I speak to you in a very rude way. We go to bed that night. You're expecting an apology that doesn't come. There's now a fissure between us. In 2 weeks, you'll snap at me, not because of something that happened then, but because I never closed that loop 2 weeks earlier when I spoke to you in an abrupt and obnoxious manner. But if I go to bed that night without us being upset at each other because I recognize I made an error and I apologize for it, then hopefully there are never these fissures. And I quote this beautiful passage in I can't remember the name of the movie, it's in the book, where this young couple, he just had a dalliance. He cheated on his wife-to-be who is pregnant with their kid. Her father tells him, well, if you want to get her back, you have to be willing to do everything possible. I'm paraphrasing. And never give up and abase yourself to no ends until, do everything possible. That takes humility because I'm abasing myself. So it's not that I'm not willing to kneel and ask for forgiveness when it is genuinely required of me. So I don't have that pride, but I'm not going to apologize to you because I made a joke about your accent. Grow up and move on.
Yeah, I hear that. So now my question becomes, what if you don't believe in God and you have the impulse that I have, which maybe you don't, but I have an impulse to want to kneel before something, to have something bigger than me that I can stand in awe of and kneel before. Is there something that you kneel before?
That's an amazing question. So in the book, I have a section where I talk about the correlation between religiosity and happiness.
Yes.
And it turns out that there is a moderate positive correlation between religiosity and happiness, meaning for some of our viewers who don't know statistics, that on average, religious people are slightly happier than non-religious people. But then to your question, I then want to assuage the people who are non-believers. You're not doomed to being unhappy because you're non-believers, precisely because, to your question, I can go and seek those awe-inspiring spiritual moments in an infinite number of ways without them being couched in a supernatural narrative. This conversation is a spiritual experience. Me meeting a guy on the street who comes up to me as a fan, who recognized me from somewhere, and then we are caught up in a serendipitous 30-minute communion that was unexpected, is a supernatural experience. So I can see divinity in the majesty of life without having to couch it in a supernatural. As a matter of fact, I think, maybe I'm wrong, that makes life that much more magisterial. The fact that I do right things, not because I know that there is a judge who will either punish me. I do the right things because that's the deontologically correct thing to do. That makes me, I think, even a better person. I'm not doing it because I'm going to go to hell otherwise. And so I think that there are a infinite number of ways by which we can be spiritual, not in a new age kind of quackery sense, in a true existential sense, in ways by just us now looking at each other's eyes. We are caught up in a tango right now of, intellectual ideas that is magic. And I don't need to bring back Moses and the Ten Commandments to feel that divinity.
That's really interesting. Do you feel like, though, there's something going on in a modern context where, if we buy into the Nietzsche idea that God is dead, which I do, even though I can feel religion is coming back, but people are relating to it, I think, in a very different way. So I'll use Jordan Peterson as my example.
I was just going to say exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this really fascinated me. So pre-sickness, he's the internet's dad, and post-sickness is now on a religious arc.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand it at first, and then I realized he sees something universal in religion that without that universal thing, that people tend to drift. And when there is no superseding, like really superseding everything else, where people believe, everyone believes that the God is in control, and that one ought to do the things that God commands. Once you get that, and I'm very much putting words in his mouth, and thankfully he's coming on the show in November, I think. But when you get hyperfragmentation, and that hyperfragmentation becomes a problem of its own. And so even though he has historically said that he doesn't believe, he's also worried about Richard Dawkins, for instance, continually pushing.
I've seen some of their little...
what do you think about that?
Look, so there are functional reasons why it makes sense to believe, right? So in other words, even as an evolutionist who is not much of a believer, I completely understand the reflex for why people need to believe. So in Richard Dawkins' case, I think he's being unnecessarily caustic in that he doesn't even allow what I just said, right? Religion sucks. It's for idiots. Let's move on. Whereas I say, look, religion makes a lot of false claims, but I get why people are religious. Now, the reason why I think in some cases religion is problematic is for the following. And actually, I have a chapter in The Consuming Instinct where I expand on what I'm about to say. Suppose you're a Martian that comes to Earth to visit, and you're shopping for the one true religion. I use the language of consumer psychology. And you start asking a bunch of questions so that you find out what is the position on each of the competing religions on that question. From the most banal question to the deepest and most profound question, I can find you two religions, if not many more than two religions, that prescribe the exact opposite prescription for each of those questions. So somebody's lying and somebody's not telling the truth. So in other words, the content of religion includes an insurmountable amount of bullshit. But the reflex to believe in something bigger than you is completely understandable, and I think that's what Jordan taps into. Does that make sense?
It does, very much. Now, how do you deal with the act as if philosophy? So that was Jordan. I don't know if this is still how he explains it. I don't know if there's a God, but I act as if there's one, I think, because of the organizing principle.
Blaise Pascal, the philosopher and mathematician.
The way you say that.
You like that, huh? Ben, je parle français. Look, and I even
Ouais.
speak French.
Nice.
So even the French-speaking guy gets into trouble when he makes fun of the Quebec
Shame on
French.
you.
Shame on me. Shame on me.
I was there, but
self-flagellate.
I heard, for the record though, what you said was the way the Lebanese speak French, we're the Italians of the international French accent, something like that.
Yeah.
Like it's
It was
universally
I was
loved.
speaking about for Arabic, that the Arabic dialect
got
is
it,
the Italian
got it.
of
Ah,
yeah,
so close.
Yeah, but thank you for having listened to that. Blaise Pascal had a 2x2 matrix, if you like the original game theoretic argument. I don't know if you know. Do you know what game theory is?
Yes,
Briefly,
loosely.
game theory. So think about, say, the prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is the classic game theory context, whereby the cops find two criminals that are working in cahoots. They separate them. I mean, as literally happens as a fundamental practice of policing, and then you take each one, and each of them can confess or not. So basically, it's a 2x2 matrix. Prisoner A can confess or not. Prisoner B can confess or not. So there are 4 possibilities, but they don't know. Prisoner A doesn't know what prisoner B is going to do, and vice versa. And therefore, depending on what ends up happening, there are different payoffs in terms of how much your sentence will be. If we both don't confess, we get off free. If I confess, but he doesn't, I get, and so on. Well, Blaise Pascal proposed an exactly same thing several hundred years ago, where he said, God could exist or not, and I can believe or not. And therefore, let's go through all of the 4 cells and then show that it is optimal to then believe. So that's the functional argument for why you should believe. If God exists and you believe, you're in good shape.
Right.
If God exists and you don't believe, you're going to be in trouble, and so on. Okay.
Right.
And so I get that argument, but now this is where my purity strand comes in, my truth strand comes in, whereby I say, is it okay to believe in something that is false if I reap functional benefits from it? And it's a tough one,
Yeah.
right? Because if you have a 4-year-old child that, God forbid, is stricken with cancer.
God forbid.
Exactly. I used it advisedly precisely because we're talking about that. Usually I would flippantly say Darwin forbid. But so God forbid he is stricken with cancer. Boy, is it a lot easier to navigate through this infinite cruel reality if I believe in a God. Because God calls his angels to be closer to him, because God works in mysterious ways. There is a plan as to why little Timmy died of leukemia. Boy, that's easier than saying random shit happens and tough luck for Timmy. And that's just what it is. And so there are so many functional reasons for why people believe. And therefore, Blaise Pascal said, so just shut up and believe.
It's really interesting. So here's another angle on that. So perspectives. So the irony is, I think that Richard Dawkins understands all the pieces that add up to why religion is a thing. And I don't know why the hostility. So Richard Dawkins introduces the idea of memes, that there are things that will travel across time because they're, this is my interpretation of the point, but they're simplified enough that they can transmit very easily. And you get this thing that becomes a self-replicating idea. And anybody that's been on the internet knows exactly what a meme is at a gut level. Religion takes the most important ideas, many universal, some specific to the time, but then package it up in a meme so that everything has an answer to, well, why should I do that? So for instance, don't eat pork. Why don't eat pork? Probably because of, is it trichinosis?
Yeah.
So that's probably what they were actually protecting against. But if you say Yahweh says don't eat pork.
Well, sorry, can I interrupt you?
Please.
They didn't know why it is, and that's precisely why it is placed on the broad shoulders of some divine edict.
Exactly.
And so it's not that they knew that there is a biological reason but decided to usurp it and attribute it to God. It's precisely, and the reason I, forgive me for having interrupted you.
Not at all.
In the Consuming Instinct, I have a section where I argue for exactly what you just said, but instead of the prohibition of eating pork, I use the eating of shellfish in kosher laws and Jewish, right? So here's what happens. You're walking around in the Middle East. You can't tell by looking at something or smelling it or the water that it came from whether it is infected or not. Therefore, there is no way for there to be a statistical regularity for me to be able to predict if it's this color, I die. If it's that color, I don't die. Rather, what happens is I consume it. And in many, many cases, I keep walking in the desert. And in a few cases, I drop dead very quickly. Therefore, since I can't map a cause and effect mechanism as to when that happens, then the final place that I lay it on are the broad shoulders of God. And so in that case, what I did is I offered a very clear and very compelling biological explanation of why that edict arose. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah, that's you said far more eloquently than I could. Exactly where I was headed is that when you don't know what it is, then you need a way to transmit that idea that's going to have meme qualities.
Exactly.
And the fastest thing is God said that to do it, right?
Exactly.
And so the question becomes, did that start in an oral tradition? Or was there a guy that was like, man, these motherfuckers just will not stop eating shrimp, right? And so they're like, I'm going to have God say, probably not. It's probably one of those things where
Exactly.
it just slowly finds its way in and it's passed on, passed on, passed on. But as it narrows down to God says don't eat shellfish, it just becomes very easy for that now to propagate like wild. And it has an advantage because now people aren't dying from whatever the problem is.
Exactly right. And by the way, there are very compelling and sophisticated evolutionary explanations for the existence of religion. You want to hear them?
Please.
So there are two competing schools of thought. So an adaptation in evolutionary theory is something that evolves because it confers either survival or reproductive advantage to me. So my gustatory preferences preferring fatty foods is an adaptation that works through survival mechanism, right? My having a large peacock tail, if I'm a peacock, is something that evolves because it confers a mating advantage compared to the other male suitors who have a smaller peacock tail. Okay, so that's an adaptation. So now so the argument would be, well, what adaptive value does being religious confer? And so David Sloan Wilson, who's an evolutionary biologist, who he's invited me several times to his university. He's come on my show. We apparently are no longer friends because I said some really mean things about Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama, and he then wrote, "I hope that my good friend and wonderful evolutionary psychologist Gad Saad finds his humanity," because I became non-human because I dared criticize some of his favorite politicians. That's what a parasitized mind looks like. In any case, I do respect his scientific work. So he's a group selectionist, which basically means that he argues that some traits could evolve at the group level rather than at what Dawkins would say at the gene level. And so what he argued is that groups that are religious out-survive groups that are not religious through the mechanisms of greater cooperation, communality, cohesion. So there are very earthly biological reasons for why religiosity would confer greater survival rates to the religious than the non-religious. So that's explanation one.
Yes.
I feel like there's going to be a repeat invitation of Gad Saad on the show.
Oh, brother. Number 3 is already guaranteed.
Now, here's the second one. This is a term that many of your viewers would not have heard, but it's a very important term in evolutionary theory. It's called an exaptation. An exaptation is a trait that is a byproduct of evolution. It didn't evolve to be of that form because it confers some adaptive value. If you like, it's a path-dependent accidental byproduct. So for example, the color of our skeletal system does not confer us any adaptive advantage. It's just an engineering path-dependent outcome, okay? Now, the exaptation argument for religion is that religion piggybacks as a byproduct on neuronal systems that evolved for other purposes. So, example, human beings have evolved the coalitional psychology mindset there is blue team, there's red team. There is us who are in the group of 150, and there's the rest of the world who are all assholes. So we very easily view the world as us versus them. It's an innate part of the human mind's architecture. Well, what does religion do? Certainly the Abrahamic religions, they piggyback on that mechanism. There are the Jews and there are the Gentiles. They are the believers in Islam and the kuffar, the non-believer, which is a derogatory term. There are the ones who are going to be accepted into the grace of Jesus Christ, and the rest of us assholes who are going to burn in eternal damnation. So each of those religions puts the marker of blue team, red team in a different way, but they all do the blue team, red team. So in that view, religion is, if you like, kind of a parasitic thing that is piggybacking on neuronal systems that exist for other purposes. So if you want the classic people for each of these two camps, David Sloan Wilson would be the adaptation guy. Pascal Boyer would be the exaptation guy. And both have been on my show. So for your viewers who want to look at both of these guys, great work.
And that's really interesting. So I grow increasingly concerned. In fact, this is how I got pulled sort of to the far, far edges of the culture war, I started looking around and realizing, whoa, we're getting very divided, and that division does not go away by itself. And I can feel things sort of ratcheting up. And that led me to, okay, what is it that's allowing a fragmentation that we didn't have before? Now, part of it is what I'll call algorithmically induced psychosis. So you're just, the algorithms understand what you like and what enrages you, but above all, what causes you to interact. And so that already creates, you don't even have to be geographically connected and you can find your red and blue teams. But maybe more importantly is the breakdown of religion as one sort of grand unifying narrative that tended to play out geographically.
Right.
So you would get a religion, it would become the dominant religion of the area. And I mean, you see as old as time, it really ends up becoming, as we start getting into larger and larger groups, to your point about in-group, out-group, it becomes one religion versus another. And for God knows thousands of years, that was how things divided. It was, you were more divided by religion than you were geography.
Yes.
So you could, from Yuval Noah Harari's perspective, this was a thing that allowed us to come together in gigantic groups.
Yes.
And still cooperate flexibly in a way that, say, ants can't. They can cooperate in huge numbers, but not flexibly. But religion gave us a thing, I've never met you, but we believe in the same God. We have the same in-group, out-group.
Exactly right.
Yeah, and so you put together social media, algorithms, and the death of that grand unifier, and now you've got a problem. And I think that's what Jordan is trying to get people to see. That, and I think he really believes that there's a lot of wisdom contained in the maps of meaning level breakdown of the stories themselves. And I know you guys talked in your most recent interview about, like, he threw out one example of the name Eve means like one you contend with, something like that.
Right.
So you get a very deep, if you knew that word to mean that, you would suddenly get like a wink, wink, nod, nod about what men and women are to each other. They are the thing you want to contend with.
Look, yesterday, the gentleman who was praying for me as I was leaving the car, I told him that, I was very open to the fact that religion contains certain incredible wisdoms that have been tested throughout time, and therefore I can be sympathetic to many of its teachings, which of course made him very happy. Now, what I didn't tell him, the next part, is that also I don't know if it's in Deuteronomy or so, someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but take your insolent children to the gates of the city and stone them to death. Suddenly that becomes, it's metaphorical, it's allegorical. So you can't pick and choose the buffet of what. So items 1, 3, 7, and 8 are beautiful morality. The other ones that are completely insane and immoral, will forget him. God was joking. So that's why I don't like the idea of fixating my entire moral compass on a particular code. I'd like to think that we've evolved a moral compass that would allow most of us, unless we're psychopaths and cheats and murderers, to be able to understand what is, good or bad without necessarily having, as Christopher Hitchens said, a celestial dictator to whom I am, I'm always trying to please and placate.
So that comes back to then how do we collectively kneel for the same reason, right? So if we've got, we used to be able to rely on religion, and I get why that was not ideal.
Yeah.
But it seems like, to your point about neuronal structures, we need something.
Yeah.
Because when we don't have it, we hyper-fragment.
Deontological principles that serve as organizing frameworks for understanding
Do
the
you
world.
think it will work though? When you say that, you sound so smart that I'm already terrified that no, for real. I hate that this
Even
is true.
as I said it, I wasn't sure that could work. But I'd
Yeah.
like to think, as a smiling optimist, that there is a way out of the impasse that doesn't necessarily require religion. The beauty of truth, the beauty of knowledge, the beauty
How do
of
you
kindness.
memify it though? How do you
Yeah.
make it contagious, but in a positive
That
way?
might be above my pay grade. If I answer that one, I win the Nobel Prize.
That's fair, and I will pay for your flight because man. So is this becoming one of the most important questions? I think it is.
Yeah.
Like, what is going to be that replacement? So Jordan, who I admire greatly, has reverted back basically to religion.
Yeah.
And we've all gotten to watch him do it in real time.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that you can demarcate his personal life with the illness. Like that,
Yeah.
I think is very meaningful. But we need something. There has to be something. People need to be asking and answering this question. I really don't have the answer. I think you're probably closer than I am, but we need something.
Well, build a family, do meaningful things. So one of the things I talk about in the book, I say that there are two paths to immortality that do not require belief in the afterlife. Number one, I literally become immortal by having children. They share half my genes. They are vehicles of my immortality. Now that sounds kind of vulgar and materialist, right? That I'm viewing my children, but they are. That's why I would jump in front of a bus and get killed to save them, right? I mean, that's the whole.
I come from an evolutionary lens, so that does not sound weird to me at all.
Well, exactly. The second way by which I can become immortal is through mimetic immortality, to use the original term of Dawkins, is by leaving things off that other people will consume. It could be the gorgeous bridge that I created. There is a guy who built the Golden Gate Bridge, and his legacy is secured. There is a guy who's created this content that hopefully will be watched in thousands of years from now. So there are ways by which I could leave my signature forevermore without couching it in some eternal narrative. So now, I would love, I joked yesterday, I can't remember in what context, someone asked me something and I said, oh, well, I plan on never dying. So I understand the incredible existential angst that we all feel that the party is really going to finish soon. We really are on a death penalty situation. We're all on death penalty. So I'd like to believe that the party is going to go on in some other realm, in some other wormhole. But even if I disassociate myself from this very hopeful narrative, I can be immortal. My children are my ticket. My books, this conversation is my pathway to immortality. That's why I say, do meaningful things in life, right? I argue that anything that allows you to instantiate your creative impulse is well on your way for you to having purpose and meaning. Whether I am a chef or a stand-up comic or an author and professor or a podcaster, each of these pursuits share one thing in common. They create something that wasn't there before I came along and created it. That makes me immortal. So there are ways by which I can seek eternal life without believing in a celestial dictator.
Now we just have to find a way to seek that eternal connection that makes us draw people in closer, not push them farther away. It's interesting. I'll say one more thing on this, and then we should probably move on to the next fascinating topic that I have lined up. But there has to be an in-group and an out-group because of the way that our brains are wired.
Yeah.
great if the outgroup were aliens.
Yes, I've always said there'll be peace on Earth when aliens attack us.
Yep. But they would have to attack because clearly, if they're already visiting, which I have not looked at this, so do I think probably not? But
I agree.
a lot of people think they have. Hasn't really changed anything. So yeah, I don't know, man. There needs to be some way for us to here. Oh God, let me give you a really bad option. It's really fucking terrible because we've already run this experiment. But the really bad option that seems like the last sort of stable thing was whatever country you're in, be proud of it. Try to do amazing things for the people in your country. Be all inclusive, all those in your borders, and then try to exist in a connected framework with the other countries that is cooperative. But if they fuck with you, then I would expect an aggressive response. That I know is terrible. I'm just exploring an idea. I don't want anybody freaking out. In fact, just hit me up with the better idea because I'm all for it. But please anchor it in reality.
Right.
That would be my only request.
So to that point, when we talked about earlier the faux positivity guru, he's not anchored in reality. And that's what upsets me.
Yeah.
Love conquers all. The problem why people have cancer is because there needs to be more love in those cells. The reason why the Middle East is a mess because we need more love. Fuck off.
Let me ask you a very Lex Friedman question. Can you steel man his position?
So that means I always forget the straw man, steel man. Tell me
I'm pretty
again
sure
what-
it's Brett Weinstein. So a straw man is you build a cheesy version of it so it's easy to knock down. A steel man is like, I'm really going to put myself in his position. No, assume that he is well-intentioned and build the best case for his argument. Now, you may still see the fatal flaw in it, but that you really attempt to say, like, this is where I think he's coming from.
So this is really speculative because you're putting me on the spot.
Yeah, sure.
Come up with discover a new religion where the fundamental central tenet, the universal law of God, of the one final true religion, is that under no circumstances should you ever do anything other than love every other human being. If you were to find that religion, and if that religion were to parasitize all human beings, then we would be able to instantiate every one of the bullshit tweets of Lex Friedman. Short of that, I live in the real world where things don't operate according to that, and it's not going to happen.
That's interesting. Thank you for that. That really helps me understand what you hear when he talks. I'll give you my steel man argument,
Sure.
though we both agree that it is, when taken literally with what he says, it is naive. But my steel man of what I think he's trying to convey is humanity has a massive amount of suffering inherent to it, but humans can and will change their behavior when they center themselves around love, which is a very real neurological state. And when somebody looks at their son and sees my child, they treat them warmly and they want good things for them and all of that. When a father looks at their son and sees a threat to their legacy, they will ostracize them.
Right.
And there are countless stories about that ultimate collision of father and son, where either the father kills the son or the son kills the father.
Succession.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus Christ. One of the most terrifying. So those are both real states that humans are capable of. And if we can nudge ourselves towards I'm going to put love at the center of my heart in this moment. And my wife and I say this to each other a lot. In this moment, fill your heart with love for me, and now reapproach this argument. And sometimes you can actually shift the way you feel, and it's going back to that idea of perspectives. All of a sudden, I stop seeing my wife as somebody who, for whatever reason in this moment, is trying to fuck me up. And then I shift, and I'm like, oh, wow. Right. I'm just not seeing her value system or whatever. And so now all of a sudden we can overcome that. Now, where he's being naive is he's not accounting for the fact that doesn't fucking scale.
Right.
Like, I get it.
Yes.
It's wonderful, but I don't know that I want to talk him out of it. So he's not going to be the one to solve that problem. But he is going to be somebody who will model that enough that there will be some percentage of people that go, you know what, Lex reminds me to center myself around love in this moment, and I'm going to do it. So he has not solved the grand problem, and he comes across very cheesy sometimes, but I think his heart's in the right place.
You know, I think that might explain why you receive fewer death threats than I do.
I think you might be right.
Right? Because you've taken the exact same stimulus, in this case, Lex, and I've taken a less charitable position, which by the very nature of my taking this less charitable position is going to create more, negative response to that, right? So the people who love Lex will say, "Stop! Why are you hammering on him?" Actually, some people were writing to me saying, he's just a young guy. I said, he's almost 40. Alexander the Great had conquered Asia at 20. When is it open for me to attack the 40-year-old child? So, but I think just your disposition, and not that I'm a very affable, very kind-hearted guy, but I do have that punchy quality, for better or worse. You are able to flip that sphere in a way where you come up with a very charitable interpretation, and maybe I could learn from you how to better do that.
Well, now let's make it even more complicated. I don't know that that would be the most useful approach for a world that ought not care about the individual. I'm going to have to define all this. I don't want anybody fucking clipping this out of context. For a world that doesn't care about the individual, and the world does not. The world, not people.
Yeah.
The evolution, time, a better way. Time does not care about the individual. Wisdom does not care about the individual. So I don't know that it would be effective for this amorphous entity that we will call wisdom to want for you to be different than you are, because you offer a perspective that I find helpful, in that you will face challenges that they're too muddy the first time I encounter them. And you'll give a real clear jab to the nose of that idea, which then gives me, I wrote it down last time. My nomological assessment of the situation. So you'll throw a jab and I'm like, ooh, that's an interesting perspective. Then I look at somebody else's jab and that's an interesting perspective. But if I don't get the full range,
you're missing something.
I'm not mapping out the full reality of this thing. And so for me, I can only give the take that I actually feel in my heart. And so that's the one I feel. But I think both of us revealed more about ourselves than we were revealed about Lex.
Yes.
And so what I hope is interesting for people is, now you have two more perspectives on the issue. And instead of needing to adopt anyone's all of us are too narrow in our interpretation, period. Yes. So maybe Lex is as easy to box up as it's naive. Maybe mine is, he's always trying to make everything empowering. Whatever. Like, we're all in an overly simplified box, right? And it's in being able to hear all of us that people can form the most useful opinion. And this is why, I didn't mean for this to be the transition, but this is why I'm so freaked out about freedom of speech. You have to have it. You have to let everybody say what they think is true. Even if you think some of them are fucking psychopaths, you've got to let them speak, because everybody ends up silencing the wrong person. Can I
demonstrate the most extreme manifestation of what you just said?
Please.
I'm Jewish. I grew up in the Middle East, escaped Lebanon because of my being Jewish. I support the right of Holocaust deniers to spew their bullshit. There is nothing that you can say that is more offensive than denying the Holocaust. Okay, there's almost nothing. I can't think of any. It's a historical reality that has been documented more than one could ever imagine. It is the wholesale extermination at a mass scale level, industrial level of a people. So what could be more offensive and insulting than saying, guess what? It never happened. But if you believe in freedom of speech, that's the price you have to pay. There has to be assholes, racists, imbeciles, falsehood spreaders that exist. It can't be, I believe in freedom of speech, but not if you make fun of French-Canadian accents. That's simply too far. You do not criticize our accent. Death upon the Jew. May the Jew return to the Middle East when we accepted him for 47 years in Quebec. That's insane. But that really is part of the architecture of the human mind, which is everyone finds their red line. You can say whatever you want, just don't draw my prophet. You can say whatever you want, but don't put, I don't know if you know the story with Saddam Hussein, apparently. If there was a newspaper and his picture was on the newspaper, in the front cover, and you were sitting at a cafe and you took your coffee mug, drank from your coffee, and then put your coffee mug on his face, which would be an act of insolence and disrespect, then there would be a secret police guy there that would take you away and put you in a bath of acid. Right?
Jesus.
So everybody has some justifiable reason why you can't do X, Y, Z. For maximal flourishing and maximal happiness of the greatest number of people, you have to adhere to the deontological principle of freedom of speech. If your feelings get hurt, fuck off, no one cares, grow a spine, grow a pair, and move on. Be anti-fragile. That will make you happy in life.
Facts. All right, freedom. Let's go deep into this topic. So at the beginning, we talked that there's truth and freedom. Those are absolutely key components of this. How else does freedom play out? I want to start with a quote of yours.
Yes.
Again, from the book. Oh, this one's great. So people that are really paying attention are going to realize you said twice that there's only one path. We'll let that slide. But this, you said, the only path to true happiness is minimal government intervention into our lives and our bank accounts. Now, maybe said a little tongue in cheek, but I believe that. So, how far do you take that?
The genesis of where that sentence came from was at the time, but now that you brought it up, I can trigger that same anger and indignation at the fact that in Quebec, I write a book based on my neuronal firings. It's not I bought this for $1 and I sold it for $2, and I'm not denigrating commerce, but there's nothing more personal than the financial rewards of your thoughts. That's why, by the way, in Ireland, they don't tax book royalties.
Really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. And I think also some art, like artistic endeavors.
Wow.
Okay.
That's really
So
interesting.
I write a book. It sells really, really well. That's very different than my professor's salary, which I've become accustomed and habituated to paying 50+% of my income in taxes.
Ouch.
But now I already given you from my professor's salary more taxes than 99% of Canadians. Now I went off here in a different, the country of where the publisher is in the United States. It's not even in your territory. I'm telling you about my horrific story in the Lebanese Civil War, and I'm telling you about my nomological networks, and I'm telling you about my satire and my stories and my words and my neuronal firings. You sit with, can I have this pen for a second? As a prop. You sit in some magic government place and go, that Jew, he's so smart. 58% of his royalties come to me. So I have 42% of my personhood that's mine. 42% of my neuronal firings belong to me. That seems excessive, right? In 1917 was the first time that the Canadian government levied income tax temporarily. 106 years later, we're still under the and what started at, I don't know what the original number was. For a few people, 5% tax grows to 7%, to 12%, to 19%, to 27%, to 56%. Where does it end? Now let's put it another way. Here's a powerful way to look at it. A slave from January 1st to December 31st works for you. You own him. Okay? The Canadian and Quebec government own me till August.
Jesus.
So from January to August, I don't work for myself. I'm not a free individual, including my thoughts, including my writings. Starting in August, I'm allowed to keep my money. That's not a healthy way to live. Now, of course, it's always couched under, but it's for the greater good. these asshole, wealthy, successful people should pay their fair share. Well, okay, what's my fair share? What's the final number? Is it 90%? Is it 97%? So that's the genesis of that line, is that you can't have individual dignity in a socialist utopia. Because as E.O. Wilson said, Tom, when asked about socialism and communism, E.O. Wilson was a specialist on social ants. He's an entomologist who studied social ants. Social ants are all equal with the exception of the reproductive queen. So when asked about socialism and communism, he said, great idea, wrong species. Okay? We're not social ants. I did something that you didn't do. I worked hard. I made choices. I deserve to make more money than you. You don't get Big Boss saying, well, asshole, I'm going to take your money to spread gender ideology in Pakistan. But that's being taken from my royalties, book royalties. Justin Trudeau gets to spend $65,000 a day on some trip because it's my royalties that are paying for him. That's not fair.
Okay, so let's look at the common good though, because I imagine that you do want to be in a place where people are thriving. You don't want to be in a place where the masses are just rioting in the streets because they have
100%.
nothing. So how do we get that balance right?
Fixed fee for everyone in the society. I'd even say fixed percentage. So I think that 25% flat fee is actually immoral. Right? When you and I go, I don't know your exact financial situation, but I know that you're a lot wealthier than I am. When we go to a restaurant, they don't say, oh, Tom, the burger is $14. Gad, let me see your income tax. Gad is $6. Joe, it's $3. So if we don't price discriminate there, why is it that for the privilege of living in an orderly society, I pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, whereas I think it's 40 or 50% of Canadians don't pay income tax? So it really is like this Ponzi parasitic scheme where there is a few people that we constantly go and say, come on, give it up. Because for the common good. No, because I'm the sucker who's paying for common good. So for example, in Canada, we have free healthcare. Well, it's free healthcare other than the fact that I pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for that free healthcare. It's free healthcare for you. It's not free healthcare for me. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
So there is nothing philosophically moral about such a society. So let's just decide what that money is. Is it 10,000 per individual? Is it 5,000? Is it 30,000? We pay it and then you F off.
Okay, so what is the barometer that you use? Is it morality? Is it something other than morality? So that I know how to approach the problem.
So let's answer it the other way. Usually the justification for why you should have a punitive progressive taxation. Progressive means that as you make more money, you pay more and more.
I'm sadly very aware of it.
Exactly.
Progressive tax.
So that argument stems from exactly one of the things that I talk about in the parasitic mind, which is the confusing of equality of opportunities with equality of outcomes. So the socialist communist ethos operates under the following premise. If there are individual differences in the outcome between people, there must be at the root of that an injustice. And us beneficent people, magnanimous people called the government, have to fix that problem by redistributing that money. No, the reason why I make more money than you is because I may have more talent than you. It's because Elon Musk did not steal his money. He did not rob people. He did a certain set of things that brought that money to him. He deserves it. He already pays more taxes than 99% of people combined, right? But then someone will come along on TV and say, he should be taxed more. It's not fair that he makes this money. So it's not fair that if I write a book that sells well, I get to keep. By the way, I calculated, Tom, just listen to this, that I would have to work an extra 15 years as a professor in order to make up the money that was taken from my book royalties. Is that fair?
Wolf.
What's fair about that? Well, it's fair to the person who hasn't worked for 4 generations, who thinks that the socialist welfare nanny state is a wonderful thing, right? But it isn't fair to the people who support the Ponzi scheme. We're the ones who are getting gang raped all day long financially. And so I stand by that line. I think I was too soft when I said that line.
Okay, let's keep going. So you benefit from the society. You, I think, want other people to benefit from the
Yes.
society. If they were to adopt the tax strategy that you're saying, which is everybody just pays whatever that set fee is.
Yes.
Obviously, for some people, that could be 50%, 80% of their take home. And if they lower the taxes enough that it's a much, much smaller number so that it's, not an insane amount for anybody, they won't have enough to run the government programs. You go into austerity. Austerity tends to lead to riots.
Although I don't think that premise is true. I mean, I can't definitively state, but there have been studies that have shown, I mean, I could be misquoting the numbers, but the general gist applies. You can get rid of, say, 20% of federal employees as a first pass, and not a single quality of the deliverable service would be noticeable, right? So the bloat exists because you are not accountable to that governmental excess, right? Think of it another way. If you, Tom, make a certain set of decisions that result in you becoming financially destitute, you have to file bankruptcy. And there are real consequences to each of us at the atomized level, having had poor financial discipline. If the government does it, there are no consequences, right? So you just print more money. So inflation goes up, but I win maybe the next election. So there has to be, I don't usually like to talk in these kind of grand ways, but there has to be a rethinking of this whole system. Because look, here's what's going to happen. If I can, I would desperately want to leave Quebec. Is that a net benefit for Quebec? Well, it might be for those who hate the fact that I made fun of the French Canadian accent. Right. But if Gad leaves and Joe leaves and John, the brain drain, is that a net benefit for the society? Well, probably not. So why don't you be a bit more fair? Why don't you not succumb to this psychology of envy and resentment? By the way, when I post something about how much I hate how I've been financially raped by the Quebec and Canadian government, someone will usually come on the Twitter feed and say, "You're such an entitled rich asshole. Why can't you pay more?" So imagine the psychology of such a person who finds that me paying 58% of my income is, by the way, it's not 58%. That's just the income. If you add up all the taxes, now you might say, what are the other taxes? We also have provincial sales tax and federal sales tax in Canada that is 15% of what I spend. So when I've already paid you 58%, the 42% that's left to me, if I now go out and spend, you take 15% of that. But now let's do property tax, let's do carbon tax, let's do school tax. I'm probably left with about 30 cents to the dollar. That's fair? That seems a bit excessive.
Yeah. So obviously very complicated problem. I look at the Gini coefficient.
Yes.
Which says
of inequality.
Yeah. So the wider the gap of inequality, the more likely you are to have violence in your society.
Yes.
And so this is one of those, going back to what you and I were saying, you've got to be anchored in reality. You want to look at things through an evolutionary lens. So I know we have to do something. I know that it is the least selfish thing that you could do is to just let people suffer. And so my thing becomes, I don't mind paying taxes. What I mind is not getting good results for my taxes.
Indeed.
And so when you were talking about, in a business, if you're not running the business well, the business goes out of business. That's just that. Like, nobody gives a shit, done. Whereas when the government spends money, they don't set a goal and say, okay, this is what profitability looks like or whatever. Because not everything they're going to do is going to generate money. So it's, okay, what's the social good and how are we going to measure it? And every sin you can possibly imagine is hidden by being vague about those two things.
Exactly.
And so that's where it scares me. But this is an area where I feel like a lot of really smart people have looked at this, and And the big debt cycle that Ray Dalio talks about is terrifying and brutal, and yet is the best system. When you look back over, I forget how many years he went back through, but it was something like 2000. And then he really looked closely at the last 500 years. And there is a hyper predictable 6 stages of things that happen. And it has all to do with basically a war, a new world order is established, good times happen in the beginning, then you get fat and lazy, and then the bad times set in, you do everything through debt, debt accumulates massively, which anybody paying attention is happening right now in the US. And then things get so bad, the Gini coefficient becomes so wide, there's so much disparity between the haves and have-nots that there's either a revolution or a war. And oftentimes a war, if there's a rising power on the outside, hey, like China, and now all of a sudden there's a hot war, which forces a switch in the New World Order. All the debt is sort of reconfigured as you come out of that, and the whole cycle starts over again.
Yeah.
And it usually lasts something like 150 to 200 years, something like that, these cycles. And it's terrifying and it's brutal if you're in that sort of final moment. And just to give people heart palpitations, Ray Dalio puts us at stage 5.5, somewhere in there.
Yikes.
Yep. And the last time I asked him, which admittedly was 4 or 5 months ago, but he pegged the odds of U.S. Civil War at 40%.
Within what period?
5 years?
Yikes.
Yeah. So
That seems a bit pessimistic.
that is the person who has made the most money off of being right in the history of the United States, telling you.
Who is this?
Ray Dalio.
I have
So
to
he's
check
built
this
the
guy out.
largest hedge fund in the world. So a hedge fund is somebody going,
Yeah,
where's the right bet? Not just in the US, but around the world. So
Wow.
literally, there's nobody that has a better proven track record of looking at the actual state of the world, making predictions, putting his money where his mouth is, and reaping the rewards of it over a 35, 40-year career. So this guy, he may still be wrong, and he'll be the first to tell you that, hey, my ultimate thing is diversification, because I know not to trust myself.
Right.
Like that's Ray Dalio's whole thing. But he also, it's not like he just bets blindly. He doesn't diversify blindly. He says nobody spends more money than me researching history, at looking at how do these cycles work. I could be misquoting, but these numbers will be directionally correct.
Have you had him on your show?
Multiple times.
Okay. very
That
cool.
he has spent something like $100 million studying history to figure out how these loops occur. It's insane.
Amazing.
So anyway, for him to be like, meh, you need to be paying attention. You need to be thinking about this. So I bring all of this up in the context of freedom. I think freedom is incredibly important, but so impact theory has gone through 3 phases. Phase 1 was really about headlines. It was a really simplified version. It was me having learned what I needed to do to my mind and understanding frame of reference. That if I could help other people build their frame of reference, their life would be much better. But it was not in the gross reality of life, the mess. It was the hyper oversimplification. Phase 2 is me trying to broaden that out. Phase 3 is just like the full reality of the complexities of life. So I don't want to talk about freedom unless we really talk about like what this is about. So, okay, that's all the sort of taxes, government, hey, you better understand debt, all that. But now give me like, what is the price of personal freedom? What does it demand of each of us? And why did you mention it in a book about happiness?
Yeah, so I'll talk about, for example, temporal freedom in your job. So remember earlier I said that one of the best ways that you can ensure occupational happiness is to pick a profession that allows you to instantiate your creativity impulse, right? Being a chef, being a podcaster, being a stand-up comic, being an author, you're creating. The second element for having occupational happiness is if you have complete temporal freedom in your job. So example, someone who is in a union factory job where it is mandated at which times you're allowed to take your bathroom break, you don't have the human dignity to decide when I can walk off the job because I really need to go to the bathroom. That's how much it's dictated. On the other hand, take the other extreme where I think I'm filled with gratitude and a sense of understanding how lucky I am that I have pretty much the highest level of temporal freedom, which means what? I still work incredibly hard, probably harder than most people, but I never feel I never feel like I'm working or I'm constrained because I'm deciding what to do. I'm the ultimate, in French we say vagabond, right? Or flaneur. You float, right? So now here I go to do impact theory. Later, maybe I'll go sit at the beach now in Newport Beach. Then I might work till late tonight preparing the book prospectus of my next book. And then I might wake up tomorrow and do. So because I feel like I'm completely in control of not only the things that I work on, but at which time I work on them and for how long I work on them, then I never feel existentially constrained. I am a free person, right? And so I think that if you can crack those two things in whatever profession you choose, creativity, impulse, temporal freedom, you're well on your way to being happy. Now, I will explain the importance of freedom in another, perhaps more banal way. I used to be a very competitive soccer player, and I played what's called the number 10 position, even though I didn't wear number 10. The number 10 position is usually the player who's the playmaker.
Striker or midfield?
No, midfield. Usually he's the guy who's just...
The David Beckham?
David Beckham played more of a right-sided midfielder. Usually the playmaker starts off in the middle of the field and then starts moving around to try to exploit spaces. Now, why am I mentioning all this? Because my biggest strengths were two of them. Number one, I was a very skillful player. I was what's called a technical player. I have great skills. And number two, I have vision. In other words, I can look for those spaces to exploit. When I would have a coach tell me, today you're playing on the left side of midfield and you have to track back Tom, my brain would explode. Not because I'm a diva who doesn't like to be told what to do. It's because you've removed my ability to float around. That's what I did best, right? And so I use that example because I want to demonstrate that the concept of freedom can apply in choosing a job, in the grand sense of when we say freedom of speech and freedom of consciousness, but also in the context of freedom to move around on the soccer field. And so freedom is everything, man. It allows me to go through my day unencumbered by schedules. It allows me to play in a field without being told where I need to go and so on. So freedom is the whole enchilada.
Why do you think that matters so much?
To me?
Abstract it out of yourself, because if we're trying to give people the ultimate map to happiness, why does that matter? Why should they work so hard to make sure that they're able to have the time freedom or autonomy? Or
because it's ultimately personal agency, right? It's me at every microsecond deciding what my next second will be. My wife often jokes with me when she sees me stressed. She goes, why are you stressed? I'll say, because I have 3 meetings this week. She goes, that's it? That's what's stressing you? Well, because I know that I have a departmental meeting from 10 to 12:30, and then I have to go teach from 1 to 3, and then I have to meet these. Therefore, I can't instantiate my freedom. Right. So I always joke that one of the worst possible jobs that I can imagine, I hope I don't get death threats from flight attendants. I will, is flight attendants or pilots. Why? Because the minute that they get into the plane and the door closes, I'm not talking about fear of crashing. I'm afraid of fear of freedom, of lack of freedom. I know that for the next 6 hours, you're going from New York to Lisbon, and there is nothing that you can do to extricate yourself from that reality. That drives me insane. I can't handle it. So I think it ultimately boils down to just personal dignity and personal agency.
It's interesting. Do you think that one's universal?
I mean, I do think that it's universal. I think the problem, and hence why people don't end up being happy, is that, first of all, they don't know themselves enough to state it in the way that I just did. And oftentimes they can't, either for life circumstances or pragmatic realities. I need to put food on the table, and I need to be a bus driver because it has good benefits, and I'm a union man. Therefore, I can't pursue what Gad Saad is telling me, which is pursue my creative impulse. And so that makes people unhappy, because deep down inside, I think it is a universal quest, but pragmatic realities don't allow me to instantiate that quest. And therefore, I wake up at 75 and say, my life has sucked. I never wanted to be an accountant, but my dad told me to be an accountant because it was a good job and secure job to have. But I wanted to be an artist.
That one's really interesting for me. So this is where I think know thyself, as you just said, is really important. So here's how I think people should think through, do I be an entrepreneur? And obviously I'm coming at it from a slightly different lens than you. Do I become an entrepreneur or do I become an employee? I have a almost pathological need to control my life. And I have a real problem with authority, being told what to do. Like you, when I see a bunch of meetings on my schedule, oh my God, like I literally go nuts. But I have a gigantic risk tolerance. So when everybody else gets to go home on the weekend and they know my paycheck is coming, I don't. So I have to worry about making sure your paycheck is coming. I have to take responsibility if your paycheck isn't coming, right? So it all falls on me. I have to think through all that stuff. It's going to be my name on the lawsuit. Like, it's just, there's a real weight to deciding you're going to run your own company. And that isn't for everybody. And I have seen, whenever I say this, I picture the poem Howl by Allen Ginsberg. I've seen the greatest minds of my generation laid waste by, well, I forget the exact line, but I've seen the greatest minds of my generation laid waste by trying to be an entrepreneur and realizing, oh my God, this sucks.
Right.
I actually make way less money than I was making, and it's so much stress. So it's like, God, what is it? I think it was acting. Like, if you can imagine yourself doing anything other than acting, go do that, because like acting is just rejection. Same with entrepreneurship. If you can imagine yourself doing anything else, go do it, because entrepreneurship is just failure. It's failure and stress.
And I don't know if you remember in the book, I have a whole chapter on persistence and the anti-fragility of failure. And there, what I talk about is that very few, if any, meaningful pursuits in life are not going to be littered with endless rejections and prospective failures. And I try to identify the most extreme examples of that. So I looked for the greatest of all time in different fields. So Lionel Messi, the greatest soccer player of all time, and anyone who says otherwise is an affront to human dignity. Lionel Messi was told that he would never be a professional soccer player because he was too small and slight.
Bro, he's tiny.
He's tiny.
How the fuck did he pull it off? He really is amazing.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank
you. I love it. Like, he's your son.
He's like my son. Okay. Number 2, Michael Jordan, cut from his sophomore high school team. J.K. Rowling, rejected by every publisher until the last one. Steven Spielberg, rejected by USC school 3 times. And so imagine if each of these folks had decided at some point on the trajectory of no, you suck, said, yeah, I guess I probably suck. And we would have never known Messi and Jordan and Spielberg and Rowling and so on. So that's part of life. When I send a paper to an academic journal to publish, certainly if it's a top journal, you're talking about rejection rates in the order of 90 to 95%.
Ooh.
Now, this is a paper that from the moment that you first thought about the idea of running those studies, to applying and getting the granting money, to running the study, to analyzing the data, to writing up the paper, to sending it, you're talking probably a 2 to 4 year cycle. And that process has a 90% failure rate, and yet scientists still exist. So a large part of being a successful scientist is just being dogged, that you're going to just, so it fails at this journal, you send it to, by the way, when it's not rejected at that journal, it still has to go through 2-3 rounds of revisions. So I probably will have spent 4, 5, 6 years battling in getting that paper through the pipeline before you get to see it and read it. And so academia is nothing but doggedness, and of course all the other things, creativity, but persistence is a fundamental part of the thing. So you can't do anything meaningful if you're not dogged and anti-fragile to failure.
Okay, so we talked earlier about one of the ways you become anti-fragile, which is to want your ideas to be challenged. But how do you build that resilience?
You make decisions throughout your life with that mindset. So let me give a concrete example. When I knew that I was good in 2 things and I was interested in doing 2 things. I want to be a professional soccer player and I want to be a professor from a very young age. when my soccer career was dead because of some injuries and other circumstances as a late teenager, and now I was heading off to do my undergrad, so I knew that I would be living an academic cerebral life for the rest of my life. I thought, what is the field that I should study for my undergrad that would be the most complex, that would train me in the same way that you go to a CrossFit gym, even if you're a soccer player and you do abs. Well, the abs is, you're not going to play soccer with your abs, but you need everything to be fit, right? Well, I knew that I would live a life of ideas. How can I train this mind to be the most rigorous analytical machine? Well, guess what? Study pure mathematics. And so I went and did an undergrad in mathematics and computer science, not because I thought that I was good in it, but I knew for sure that I would be unlikely to become a professor in mathematics, but that would be the thing that would serve as the greatest stressor. The path of most
find
resistance.
the things that are going to be difficult, useful,
right?
but difficult.
Hercules, there's the famous story of the bifurcation. You can go this way or you could go that way. That way is easier, and you'll get all the hot girls and the wine and so on. Or take the path of most resistance. Well, take that road. And so I think that mindset.
I don't know the story of Hercules well.
I think that's the one. I hope I'm not
more.
I think I'm not.
I think it works conceptually, even if it isn't. So I just want to follow that. So what is the moral?
So he's just take the path of greatest resistance in order to be able to have the most fulfilling and meaningful life. So the specific Greek goddesses that met him or whatever, I don't remember who they were.
Sure.
But that's the bifurcation.
I'm going to project something. Tell me if this is in line with what you're saying. So I think a lot about what I'm trying to convey to people. Like I feel like I have a thing inside me that I'm trying to give to people. And that my reason I'm put on this earth, I hate that fucking phraseology, but sure, is that you can control your life. That the game of life, oh, you're going to hate this because you like soccer. The beautiful game is life. It's not soccer. And
how dare you, sir?
Right? I'm an affront to human dignity.
Exactly.
And you need to learn how to play it well.
Yeah.
And the way that you learn how to play it well is to learn whatever it is you need to learn in order to not be controlled by anything other than yourself.
Yes.
That to me is freedom. And when you started talking about, and again, I know you're not sure if this is the actual story, about Hercules being given two paths, one where he can get probably the things he thinks he wants quite easily, or you can take the hard as hell path. Now, I've tried to boil down what I think life is. It's a weird way to say it, but close enough. And what I think life is a quest to feel good about yourself when you're by yourself. And that going back to the thing I said earlier, evolution has guaranteed that you won't be proud of yourself unless it was hard as hell.
Oh, I like it. Listen, I'm often asked, why do you take such thorny issues? I mean, you already lead a stressful life as a productive professor. Why do you have to jump and put your hat into all kinds of battles? And my answer that speaks exactly to your point about, you have to feel comfortable and proud within yourself is it's exactly that. So I usually use the following imagery. When I go to bed at night and I put my head on the pillow, the only thing that can forestall insomnia in order for me to sleep well at night is if I felt that I never modulated my speech, my positions for some pragmatic careerist thing, right? Don't say that, even though it's the truth, because then that would reduce the likelihood of you getting that professorship or that job, right? If I do that, then I feel I'm fraudulent. Then I feel I'm fake. I'm inauthentic. I'm a fraud. And the most important thing for me is to always match my punishing code of personal conduct, not yours. I don't care what you think of me. I care what I think of me, to your point. And what I think of me is a really high perfectionist standard that I have to adhere to. And therefore, that's why I act the way that I do. And here I want to mention arguably the most profound thing that anyone ever told me. And in this case, it happens to be my mother. Many years ago, she looked at me and she said, Gad, the world doesn't operate according to your purity bubble. And the quicker that you find that out, the happier you'll be. Well, guess what? Till today, I often struggle with that because there's a clash between this beautiful, stylized purity bubble that I'd like to live in and the ugliness of the outside world. And so oftentimes when I'm indignant at somebody on social media, it's because I can't believe that you could be such an asshole, right? Whereas if I were more steeped in pragmatic reality, I would say, well, these kinds of folks exist and who cares? But it's my strain of purity, which drives my punishing personal code of conduct that causes me to react that way. So I'm totally with you.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think each of us have some animating spirit that gives us superpowers. My wife has a gear I almost don't have, which is righteous indignation. And I've always watched her click into that gear, and I see how, like, if you've ever seen a honey badger, in fact, oh my God, my wife is a honey badger. So when you see a honey badger attack things that are way bigger than it, you're just like, there's something impressive about it that makes even the bigger thing be like, whoa.
Yeah.
Like, it's just there's so much aggression, so much certainty that alone gives you pause. And every time I see her do it, I'm like, that state of mind is a superpower because it eliminates anxiety, it eliminates fear.
100%.
She cannot help herself but charge forward. And so it's clearly, even though it is very rare that I'll find myself in that gear, it's very rare, or it's very clear that there's a huge evolutionary advantage. Can't be wrong too many times, but it is one of those things, like, there's a reason that there's a spectrum of personalities when you look at it again from the group selection standpoint.
Absolutely. And by the way, to the point of indignation, you mentioned righteous indignation of your wife. So in preparing the research and for writing the happiness book, of course, I got into all of the ancient wisdoms, the Stoic philosophy, and so on. And I had recently a guest on my show, Donald Robertson, who wrote the book How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, which is a book on Marcus Aurelius. Really, really cool book. Very, very beautiful read. And at one point, I saw some Stoic edicts that, in my view, were contrary to basic evolutionary principles. So let me mention it. So the Stoics will say that oftentimes what causes you pain is not the event itself, but the way you respond to the event, right? So for example, if someone defames you on Twitter or in life, insults you, well, who cares about that event? Why don't you rise above it as a Stoic and realize that if you go like this, then it goes away? That can't make sense in every situation because you and I have evolved the emotional system that causes us to be indignant if, for example, you engage in reputational damage, right? And it's precisely the fact that you're worried that if you say something that is very insulting, that I might beat the shit out of you, that stops you from doing that. If we remove that from the playing field, if under no circumstances will I ever be righteously indignant at something ridiculous that you've said about me, then there's a lot of miscreants that will game that, right? Because they know that Tom is a full Stoic and he will never respond irrespective of what I write about him. So even in the context of the breathtaking wisdom of the Stoics, I think some of their tenets are irrational from an evolutionary perspective.
That's interesting. And I think that the evolutionary lens is pretty profound. It goes back to the thing about religion that I find interesting, which is religion is trying to present in a simple way that can be handed off those things that are most likely to be high functioning for you at the time that it was written. Obviously, over time it will change, which is why I actually think that religion does need to ignore some things and embrace others. But evolution does the same thing. When you look at, like we were talking off camera about something I'd never heard of, which is an evolutionary literary criticism.
Exactly.
Like at looking at how well did this story get to the human condition?
Right.
That to me is very wise, because now going back to one of the core beliefs that makes up my frame of reference is that we have these biological algorithms running in our brain, that the brain is designed to be a prediction engine, and that when you don't know what the truth is, the easiest way to assess it is to say, my current belief system makes the following prediction. So if I do this, I will get this result. So I will do that thing. Did I get that result? If yes, then I must be pretty close to ground truth. If no, I'm off somewhere. Something is broken in the beliefs that make up my prediction engine. And so that's where, if people can really take a framework around evolution, I think that they can very quickly get to something where it'd be like, oh, this makes sense to test, because looking back, I can, at least from an informed hypothesis standpoint, I can come up with a reason why this might be true.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for your defense of the value of evolutionary psychology, because one of the things that I get righteously indignant about is when some imbecile on social media says, but evolutionary psychology is just a bunch of unfalsifiable, just so storytelling, and nothing could be further from the truth. And here I'm going to demonstrate that by pointing to our earlier conversation about nomological networks of cumulative evidence. It is within the epistemology of evolutionary psychology to look for all of those distinct lines of evidence before you make the proclamation that something is an adaptation. In other words, the standard of evidence that you have to reach before you make that pronouncement is actually unbelievably higher than for all of the other scientific claims that are made out there. So it's actually the exact opposite of what the idiot is accusing me of. He's thinking I'm sitting with a cognac, a cigar, and I'm going, let me make up some bullshit story about why men like women to be of that body type. It's just some fanciful story. Whereas I can get you data from across cultures, from across time periods, from across art traditions that demonstrate that that body type is preferred for very clear evolutionary reasons. So I'm with your wife here. There are very clear, justifiable reasons why you should be at times honey badger indignant.
No, I get it, and I think it works. Going back to, it also has a price to pay. I will say that
my cortisol
levels
go up.
Yeah, the number of times that I have to go to my wife and say, the question you need to ask right now is, what are you trying to accomplish?
Right.
Because if what you're trying to accomplish is ideologically smashing that person in the teeth, not physically, obviously, but like you want that sort of, they must understand that they're wrong. Cool, keep going. If, on the other hand, you have some other outcome, you're trying to get a deal done or whatever, you might want to approach this.
I suffer from not seeing that at times.
Yeah. And there is a conflict that I get from your perspective where it's like, you don't want to cross the line and not be authentic.
Yeah.
And so in fact, my pitch to you about you're not as big as you should be given how good your ideas are. And so now the question becomes, why aren't you as big? Now, you just so happen to, I can just project all of my own realizations about myself onto you. So this will be fun. The reason that you're not as big as you should be for how good your ideas are is because you have emotional friction around picking a lane. So if you're going to be broad, what you have to do is you have to tell people what the connective tissue is. And once you give them the connective tissue and they can be like, oh, okay, cool, here are the ideas that we're going to hang our hat on. Then it's like, oh, cool, thank you. You've given me a way to group you. You've told me you're in a new lane, fine, but you have to tell me what that lane is.
That's deep, man. Thank you. That's
for
beautiful.
Sure. Trust me, this is me beating the shit out of myself
That's
trying to figure out.
beautiful, really.
So once you do that, one, it will clarify your own thoughts because there are going to be guests that you shouldn't have on, even though you're interested and it's fascinating. At some point, like that one probably exists outside of the thing you really care about, at least in the grander scheme. I think that kind of thing is important. So my point is, you want to be authentic 100%, but you also want to be strategic. You don't just want to say like everything that crosses your mind. It's like, what's my goal in this situation? How do I align myself? And so, when I look at the Canadian accent thing, whatever, it's like, I actually kind of get that one. Like part of who you are clearly as a person is to be playful, to be funny. And I heard Jamie Foxx talk about this. And it was really heartbreaking for me because he's he's of an earlier generation where he got famous walking the line of things you're not supposed to say. And that made him him. And that was the fun. And that's why we loved him. And people may not even remember him from that era back in like in Living Color and stuff, where he was fucking outrageous. And what he said was, in this cancel culture era, you have to tuck it in a bit.
Yeah.
And I knew exactly what he meant. He had to dial himself down. He had to not go for the joke that might risk spilling over the line, because you're not forgiven for that anymore. It's not like, oh, you're a comedian. And to your point,
isn't that tragic though?
It is literally tragic, because I think humanity loses something, because now you're asking the Messis of the world, don't get quite that good.
Exactly.
Right? Like Messi in his prime, it didn't look human.
Yeah.
And it inspired me so much to think, wait, I could get that good at something? I mean, I'm not going to get that good at soccer given my genetics, but like, could there be a thing I could get that good at? It's just super fucking inspiring and just entertaining. Let's say it doesn't inspire me to want to do it. I still get to witness it.
Yeah.
And so the thought of comedians tucking it in is fucking heartbreaking to me. So I get why that might be a bright line for you, that like I'm over my dead body. Like no one is going to make me backtrack on that, because I'm not going to tuck it in, because that's something to me that when you carry it out, it's really problematic.
Well, you're really identifying my psychology. That's beautiful, man. That's brilliant.
Thank you, sir.
I might have to start calling you Dr. Tom.
Wow. I'll take an
finish.
honorary doctorate from you. Yeah, I just think that is really important for people to understand. What is my bigger strategy here? What am I trying to get out? I'm not going to cross the line of being authentic, but I'm not going to treat everything like it's the fight.
No, amen. I got it. I get it. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know what to add to that, other than I'm actually, truly, I'm not blowing smoke up your proverbial behind. I'm amazed by the psychological acuity that you just exhibited.
Oh, thank you, man.
And I don't think you could have been successful in life in the way you have if you didn't have those insights. And this is why, by the way, I'm not an academic elitist. In other words, when we talked earlier, for example, about Dave Chappelle, and I said to you, remember what I said? I said, Dave Chappelle is probably more intelligent than most of my colleagues.
Oh, Jesus,
he doesn't
so
have
smart.
all of our fancy degrees. So there are many, many ways by which one can exhibit their profundity, and you certainly have done so in this last analysis.
Yeah, very kind. Thank you for your book. It's absolutely incredible. Where can people follow you, get the book?
So they can go to my website, www.gadsaad.com, and then there you can access my YouTube channel, my Twitter feed, my podcast. If you want to get a copy of the book, you can either order it straight from the publisher, Evolutionary, or from Amazon. The Saad, S-A-A-D, Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life.
And they are fantastic.
Thank you so much.
All right, everybody, definitely order that book. And speaking of things you should do, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. To learn more about artificial intelligence, check out this episode with Mo Gadot.
We've never created a nuclear weapon that can create nuclear weapons. The artificial intelligences that we're building are capable of creating other artificial intelligences. As a matter of fact, they're encouraged to create other artificial intelligences.